Hello everyone. Today, I'm going to be talking about Paul McCartney. Even got my merch on from the 2017 Australia-New Zealand tour. Good to go. So for the last 6 months or so, I've been listening to, with little interruption, non-stop Paul McCartney music. Late last year, I made a video on his Ram album, which reopened the treasure trove that is his post-Beatles career. And what struck me was that in many ways, this music was as good as the stuff he was making in the 60s, but I just hadn't been exposed to it. I knew a few of his more famous records, but certainly not all 22 studio albums he has released since the breakup of the Beatles. Those records consist of all his solo studio LPs, plus every Wings album. But that's not including his 5 classical albums. Yeah, Paul McCartney's written operas. The 3 experimental albums he released as The Fireman, 8 live albums, 4 compilations, and 9 others that consist of movie soundtracks, cover albums, and reinterpretations of previous releases. The man's made a shit ton of music. In fact, if we gather all these releases together that span the years between 1970 and 2021, he has released a total of 50 albums in some form or another. 50 albums over 51 years basically averages 1 album released every year since leaving the Beatles. Now, forgive me for assuming, but I would imagine not all of you have listened to every single one of these albums. Hell, you may not have even got around to all of his Wings material, but that's okay. That's why I'm here. I've taken it upon myself to rank all of his studio albums from worst to best in a convenient list. Of course, this is subjective. It's my own opinion. That goes without saying. And of course, there's no Beatles in this list. They're a whole separate thing. The whole point of this video is to showcase his immense talents that continued after the Beatles. I want this list to act as an entry point for people looking to explore his catalogue, maybe for the first time, but also as a kind of story of the man himself. I had a really fun time doing this. If you need some cheering up, and let's face it, we all kind of do right now, I would highly recommend going through his body of work chronologically. Honestly, this is just one of those things that you can do now in the age of streaming. Listen to 50 years worth of an artist's music. Something that would have been a very costly endeavor even 5-6 years ago, but now something we can just take full advantage of. This is especially fun to do now because over the last 10 years, Paul McCartney's been re-releasing his Wings and solo work as part of the Paul McCartney Archive collection. It's got demos, outtakes, acoustic recordings, and of course singles that didn't quite make the album. It really helps create that holistic Paul McCartney experience. Because I've spent so long on this as well, I've also created some Paul McCartney playlists on Apple Music that you can find in the links in the description. They're based around different genres that he tends to dip in and out of. So we've got things like Paul McCartney rock, Paul McCartney dance, love songs, psychedelia. Good or bad, Paul McCartney has an innate ability to make joyful music that just makes you smile. It's that sunny optimism of his that has really carried me through recently, and I just don't think he'll regret going on this musical journey. It's also just really interesting hearing an artist make tunes so consistently throughout the history of popular music. The way he adapts to, or in some cases defies, trends, hearing his voice gradually age through each decade, and witnessing him borrow from nearly every genre imaginable. I actually made a timeline of all the other artists that I can hear in his music, but I will get to that after this list. Okay, so there's a lot of debate around McCartney heads as to what actually constitutes as a studio album. My rule is that for it to be a studio album, at least half the material has to be new. So this means that I'll be ranking his 22 studio albums from across his solo and Wings career. And then after that, I'll be doing a sort of quicker lightning round list of all of his other miscellaneous work. One final thing before we get to the list. Due to the sheer amount of music McCartney's made, I haven't included my thoughts on every single song off every single album. Otherwise, this video would somehow be even longer than it already is. But I have made notes on every single track off every single album, and if you'd like to see them, plus more of my thoughts on Paul McCartney's music in general, you can find them by joining my Patreon. For a couple of dollars a month, you'll gain access to my written notes. I'll include your name at the end of each video. You'll have a say in what kind of videos I make in future, and much more. And as always, don't forget to hit subscribe. But now, with that being said, let's get to the list. We begin with my least favorite McCartney album, 2001's Driving Rain. This is the first album in what I consider the modern McCartney era. It's the first studio album he released after Linda McCartney's death, George Harrison's death, and also the first album of the 21st century. It's also the album where McCartney assembled the lads to fill out the sound, who are, to this day, the musicians that make up Paul McCartney's live band. Also, this cover art is just bizarre. A super pixelated image of Paul that was taken on a Casio wristwatch with a built-in camera. The album is very long. Too long, in fact. I have no idea how tracks like Tiny Bubble made it onto here. The opener, Lonely Road, is a fairly appropriate tone setter for the album. A bluesy number that sounds about as dad rock as Paul McCartney gets. I hear your music and it's driving me wild. please don't take offense to the term dad rock. It's nothing against dads, obviously. It's just that this album and this period in general has a lot of those U2, Bruce Springsteen-y sounding songs that to me are just kind of dull. Then the song Spinning on an Axis is probably the closest we'll get to Paul McCartney rapping. Don't get excited, this isn't Kendrick Lamar. In fact, it's not really much at all. There is some half-decent songs on here, like From a Lover to a Friend, about Paul accepting the love of someone new in the midst of grieving the death of Linda. There's also Magic, which is a lovely song about the night that he met Linda. Then we have the track Rinse the Raindrops, which is the first song that McCartney released on a studio album that is more than 10 minutes long. It's a relentlessly hard-rocking song made up of jammy bits of Paul and his band. In an album that I think is pretty snoozy, this one really jolts you awake and gets the blood pumping. But gee whiz, pretty much every other track on here is... ugh. There's also the song Freedom, which was included really last minute because it was a response to the 9/11 attacks, but then... since it kind of got co-opted by that very Bush-era pro-military stance, and Paul McCartney really pulled back on it. So why is this my least favorite album? Well, the albums that are just above Driving Rain on this list definitely have worse songs on them, but those albums at least have a quirk, an interesting quality to them. Whereas I find Driving Rain to be a pretty goddamn boring listen with nothing aesthetically unique about it. There's absolutely zero whimsy on the thing, which probably means a lot of people actually like this album, but not this guy. And did I mention that it's 16 tracks long and goes for over an hour? And of those 16 tracks, absolutely none appear on any future compilations, not even the 4-hour-long Super Deluxe Pure McCartney. Like, even that terrible song he made for a video game is on there. Also, apart from the tour to promote this album, Paul never played anything from Driving Rain live ever again. I will cut him some slack, as 2001 was a pretty strange time for rock and roll. Hip-hop and R&B were dominating the chart, and it would be a little while longer until people woke up to the sounds of bands like The Strokes, who really revitalized the genre into the 2000s. In making this list, I listened to his music chronologically, and it was around this point that I started to worry that Paul, in his older age, his Macca age, if you will, was just going to be producing super bland U2 sounding bits of passable rock. Little did I know that this was the last album of Paul's chronologically that I really didn't like. In fact, right after this record, McCartney went on a streak of some of his most exciting work to date. But I think that this album, which is made up of songs from before Linda's death, but also some songs from after he got together with Heather Mills, was just recorded at a very delicate time in his life. And for me, it's just not one of McCartney's strongest outputs.
That is probably the worst album, the album I hate most.
4 out of 10. Next up is...
The window was open, outside was a spaceship.
Press to Play from 1986. This is a weird album.
Nowhere to begin.
The release of this album was McCartney's first after a 3-year gap, the longest period between studio albums at the time, but it also happened to be his lowest selling album up to this point. After the disastrous release of the film that he wrote and starred in, 1984's Give My Regards to Broad Street.
You'll hardly even want to go see it. It's really a dumb movie.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Paul was looking for a fresh sound to spruce up his career, and was inspired by the flavor of recent hits like Bowie's Let's Dance, to create something with a bit of a more contemporary feel. So he enlisted Hugh Padgham to produce the album. Padgham was the hot producer of the time who developed the distinct 80s sound of big acts like Peter Gabriel, The Police, and Phil Collins, including the now famous gated reverb drum sound you hear on Collins' hit In the Air Tonight. 10cc guitarist and collaborator from Paul's previous 2 albums, Eric Stewart, also co-wrote 6 of the 10 tracks. The problem with Press to Play is that no matter how many times I listen to it, very little actually sticks in my head. Like, I've heard the song Footprints probably a dozen times, but don't ask me how it goes. It's just a bit of a messy, forgettable album. The opener, Stranglehold, is a swing and rock and roll track that as soon as it starts, my modern ears just went, okay, Paul's officially entered his dad rock phase. Phase that he really dipped in and out of for another 15 years. Like most tracks on this album, the sound is very crisp and maybe would have been a bit more of an engaging listen in its original stripped back form. But Hugh Padgham threw a bunch of screeching saxes in and a whole lot of other 80s dreck, and it all just gets very uninteresting. The song Talk More Talk has the strangest, creepiest beginning of any Paul McCartney song. That's what you heard at the start of this album review. Overlapping, pitch-shifting bits of strange dialogue before Paul blasts us with a fairly enjoyable pop hit. The sound of the song is the sound of 80s music distilled. You hear Paul saying he wanted a more now flavor to his sound, and you listen to this and you go, yep, I can see what he was going for. And then on Only Love Remains, we've got Paul's de facto love ballad of the album. It's a pretty slow one, a total bore in fact. More like Press to Stop, am I right? Yes. Come on, that joke alone was worth a like. The song Press
Tell me to press.
is the one track off this album that I think is an unabashed pop marvel, complete with drum machines and noise gates and also this really cool music video. It's Paul hitting his mid-40s and singing about the joys of marital sex. I mean, what more could you want? This is what I mean about that quirk that's just not on Driving Rain. Then we arrive at Pretty Little Head, aka Paul's very first single that completely failed to chart. And then what he did was that he tried to boost the sales of it by using new technology. He released his first cassette single, and it still, even then, didn't reach the top 75. Then on the track Angry, we take a very different tone from Paul's usual optimism and sentimentality, breaking into this fast tempo song with Pete Townsend on guitar and Phil Collins on drums, but even then, that anger is just not Paul's vibe. I'm sick and tired of sitting back listening to all of your clap traps, see what I mean? If you could get me to take the rap, I guarantee you'd leave me with a backslap. Wow. I mean, it's fun that he attempted it once, but let's hope never again. Clap trap! Then we've got the closer, However Absurd, which sounds like Paul went to the premiere of Les Miserables, heard the first few bars of Do You Hear the People Sing, and was like, I'm having that. It's actually not a bad closer. The piano and general tone has got a bit of an I Am the Walrus wash over it, and the track itself sounds like a long-lost Beatles song. I will give him points on Press to Play for attempting something radically different, but because he leans so hard into this more MTV-friendly sound, it actually really dates it and now sounds like one of his more antiquated albums. He's not played a single song from Press to Play live, ever. This is also the album that kickstarts my least favourite period in Paul McCartney's career, the late 80s, which is a period defined by too many producers and saw a serious midlife slump from Paul, which, in my opinion, continues on our next album on the list, 4.5 out of 10. After the poor sales and lackluster reviews of Press to Play from 3 years prior, Paul knew that he needed to radically change up his approach on the next album. And after 18 months perfecting the LP, he released Flowers in the Dirt to much more commercial and critical success. Yes, this album was actually pretty well reviewed in its time. Man, doesn't this album just look like a CD your nana would own? Elvis Costello co-wrote 4 of the 13 tracks on the album and also insisted that Paul McCartney use his Hofner bass for the first time since his Beatle years.
He said, what about your Hofner bass, you know, your violin bass, Beatle bass? And I was saying, well, I can try it, but it's not very good at keeping in tune. And it recorded great. That was the thing about it. The tone was really, it's got a lovely tone for a little bass.
Together, the two men produced some good quality, fairly well-written material with some of McCartney's most thoughtful lyrics in years. There's the song You Want Her To, which is probably the track in Paul's entire post-Beatles career that is most reminiscent of the kind of back-and-forth style that John and Paul did with the Beatles.
There are a couple of tracks on the album where I'd sing a sort of sweet line and then I'd find Elvis doing a sort of sarcastic line, very much like John and me used to do. It's getting better all the time, couldn't get much worse.
My Brave Face, which was the first single, is a pretty solid album opener, co-written with Elvis Costello. I actually really prefer the original demo from the Archive collection. McCartney and Costello sing it as a duet and it's just them eyeball to eyeball on acoustic guitars, very John Paul vibes.
Take me to that place.
Can recommend. Then the song Rough Ride follows and we immediately lose steam with one of my all-time least favourite Paul McCartney tracks. It's one of the many on the album that suffers from a dreadfully dated, overly 80s production sound. Like the bass and drum parts are just made up of different synths that one of the producers is playing and Paul's just relegated to acoustic guitar. I don't know, it just sounds so tacky. The beat is really sludgy and because there's no decent melody, the terrible lyrics instead float to the top as you just wait for the track to be over. A shocker. Then on the flip side, we've got this one, which happens to be my favourite song off Flowers in the Dirt. I don't know, it's just got this delightful chorus that really grew on me, has just enough 80s production for me to not write it off. And if you ever wanted to know what it would sound like if Paul wrote a song for a John Hughes movie, it would sound like this.
Did I ever take you in my arms, look you in the eye?
Also, the live version of Trippin' the Live Fantastic has some lovely harmonies on it that I really enjoy too. And if you're enjoying the video so far, go ahead and give it a like. But the back end especially of this album is so slow and just gets really monotonous on the ear. You got How Many People, which is this cringy reggae song, Motor of Love opens with some gorgeous lush harmonic synths supplied by the producers of Tears for Fears, but then the song just follows that same slow tempo syrupy nonsense that just makes you want to hit skip. My real problem with this album is that, similar as on Press to Play, Paul is so desperate for the album to sound like other people, other bands, that his style, his flavor is somewhat lost, and we end up with an album that probably sounded much better and more modern back then, but now really just feels like it's Paul out of his element. I do really like that he challenged himself and put his trust in others to help him produce a new sound, and as you'll see on this list, working with other producers has also really helped McCartney come up with a sound that he definitely couldn't achieve on his own, but it all really depends on the producer and how good that collaboration actually is. Here across all the songs, a total of 8 producers contribute to this LP in some form or another, from the Tears for Fears guys to Crowded House's producer. And I know by today's standards, it's not uncommon to have like 70 producers work on a single track. But I think, like I said, Paul was just really out of his element with all these guys. It's got some similarities with Driving Rain in that no songs appear on any future compilations, and apart from the tour that he did to promote the album, he's never played any songs live since. As much as Flowers in the Dirt was seen at the time as a return to form with some of Paul's sturdiest songs in years, they, to me, and I guess to McCartney now, seem to have not stood the test of time. 5 out of 10. I'm glad that right after this album, maybe as a way to shake off all that synthetic 80s production, Paul recorded a very acoustic live album which went on to be the very first MTV Unplugged performance released as a record. After that, he recorded his next studio follow-up and also the next album on our list. See what I mean? This is his worst period by far. Yes, our next album to close out this mid-career slump is 1993's Off the Ground, aka everybody's favourite album who love feet. 4 years after Flowers in the Dirt, Paul returned, thankfully leaving all that goopy 80s production behind, and instead decided to record most of the material live with his touring band, with each song recorded in one take after several rehearsals. Off the Ground was also the first album to feature no sizable US hit singles since Wings' first album in 1971. This is where, with Paul now 50 years old, we start leaning more into the period I like to refer to as the Beatles revivalist era, where 30 years after the Beatles first burst onto the scene, 60s fashion, music, and social awareness was really on the rise.
People struggling to survive.
This is where Paul was also starting to accept that it was okay to write something that might sound like the Beatles.
In the more recent past, I used to try and resist any Beatle influences, thinking, well, you know, I've done that bit of my career, maybe I should now try and do something completely different. But then that means that you then deny some stuff that might have been very good.
Like on the opening title track, Off the Ground, which has a laid-back, almost 60s folk feel to it. It would fit pretty well on Rubber Soul and is also the first time Paul McCartney made a song off a computer. It's also where that sense of social conscience that was more prevalent back in his Beatles days starts to come back into his writing.
Since the 60s, in my view, nothing much has happened except kind of Thatcher's Britain. So I think like a lot of the things like environment, peace, that kind of stuff, I think that still is the best philosophy. So in the 90s, I see it reappearing.
He's got songs on here like Looking for Changes, where we see McCartney put his protest hat back on as he sings about the cruelty of testing on animals.
Anyone who's ever been an animal lover, you just look at that and you think, what gives us the right to do this to this poor animal?
I saw a cat with a machine in his brain.
It's Paul being pretty edgy, but I don't know how effective it was in spreading the message. I mean, man, he hasn't been this much of an activist since 1971's Give Ireland Back to the Irish. Also, fun fact, Paul recorded another protesty song around this time, though it didn't make the album. It's called Big Boys Bickering, about the inaction of politics. It's got the one and only use of Paul using the word fuck in any of his songs.
Big boys bickering, fucking it up in every way.
And he doesn't just use it once, he uses it 17 times.
Fucking it up for everyone. Fucking it up for everyone. Fucking it up.
I mean, and you could count the song Fuck You, but I won't. Yeah, this album, there's some pretty forgettable songs on here, like the single Biker Like an Icon, which is more fun to say than to listen to. Then you've got Mistress and Maid, which is an Elvis Costello holdover from the previous album, which is just... and the song Wine Dark Open Sea gives me major Eagles vibes. He's got songs about the goodwill of people unifying and creating a better world, like on the track Hope of Deliverance, which sounds like if the song Goodnight Tonight grew up into a sensible old man. It's got a catchy Latin vibe to it that I enjoy, and in that same social conscience vein, we have the Beatles-esque closer, Come On People, which is okay, but the real gem here is after a few seconds of silence once the song ends, where we get a snippet of Cosmically Conscious, a new recording of a song that Paul wrote way back in India in 1968, and the lyrics are based off phrases that the Maharishi would say. It's a total throwback, super cool vibe, very Donovan, which isn't surprising as they were with him in India at the time. And for me, this is where the album really comes alive. It's just a shame it happens to happen in the last minute and a half. So while this album doesn't have any really terrible songs on it, like on Flowers in the Dirt, it doesn't have any great or even really good songs on it. It sort of goes back and forth between being very sweet and laid back to them being very politically minded. It's just kind of supremely average the entire way through. And this is where we thankfully finally get to the end of the absolute worst period of McCartney's career. 5 out of 10. So now we arrive way back in 1978 with my least favourite Wings album, London Town. I'll quickly point out right here that Wings had a bit of a rotating cast of 10 different musicians that across 10 years played over 7 different albums. But the 3 core members that never changed were Paul McCartney, Linda McCartney, and ex-Moody Blues guitarist Denny Laine. In 1977, Paul realised that it would be down to these 3 core members that would make up the band for London Town. The last time they were down to these 3, they made their most successful album of their career, so hope was high that they'd be able to capture some of that magic again, but it was sadly not to be. Half of this album was recorded on a luxury yacht in the Virgin Islands, which may explain why some songs like Children, Children and Famous Groupies have a certain sea shanty quality to them.
I know a tiny waterfall, a magic little place. There was a lead guitarist who lived in Epping Forest.
In fact, the album was almost called Water Wings, which I think would have been a much better title. It's also got my least favourite album cover in the whole list. Like, let's look at this thing. The different murky coloured letters, the scratchy black and white photo of the trio all rugged up. For such a sunny, poppy album that was recorded on a yacht in the Virgin Islands, this is such a strange choice. I think the back cover of the album would have been far more appropriate. The opener and title track London Town, written a few years prior, is definitely one of the more solid tunes on the album. It's very Beatles-esque, echoing Penny Lane. We then hear I'm Carrying, a very sweet acoustic love song and a real highlight for me and for George Harrison, who called this song his favourite off the album. Paul McCartney originally wrote the song Girlfriend for Michael Jackson, but eventually just put it on London Town instead. And yeah, it sounds like a Michael Jackson song. Super high falsettos almost the entire time. In fact, it's one of the tracks off this album that actually sounds like a Bee Gees hit. Mixed in are some very of-the-time synths, like on the track Backwards Traveller / Cufflink, where that primitive keyboard sound is just trying to do more than what it was capable of at the time. Likewise, the clunky synths that sound like space sound effects indulge further on the lead single and US #1, With a Little Luck. This is one of the most dated sounding hit singles of McCartney's career. It's an okay song, once again very Bee Gees, but it's just way too long for what it is. This is the sort of track that helps cement London Town as Wings' poppiest album, with some songs even getting close to disco territory. Then we've got the song I've Had Enough, which is similar to McCartney's early Beatles rockers, but without any of that youthful edge or crackling energy. Definitely had enough of this song. Then we have the track More Smooth and the Grey Goose, a very silly, adventurous rocker that goes from sounding like Wings was trying to soundtrack some glorious car chase. And then the next minute sounds like another odd sea shanty.
Was a steady boat. People said she'd never float.
This song is very divisive amongst McCartney fans as to whether it's garbage or brilliance. I definitely think it's pretty great, one of the best off the album for sure. On my first few listens of London Town, I think I disliked it even more than some albums that I've already listed, but given a bit of time, there's definitely enough to enjoy on here. But it's definitely the first post-Beatles McCartney album that doesn't have at least 1 or 2 outstanding tracks on it. It's another one of those that's consistently middle of the road, 5.5 out of 10. The next album on the list sees us going all the way back to 1971 and the inception of Wings with their debut album, Wildlife. After the critical lambasting of Paul and Linda's previous LP, McCartney steered clear from creating any music that was even remotely Beatles sounding. This was done in an attempt to help find the sound of his new band, Wings.
So I kind of knew how to be in the Beatles. I didn't know how to be in a band after the Beatles.
But in attempting this, he kind of shot himself in the foot and dug his heels into a pretty limp sound that often goes nowhere, like on the song Bit Bop, a song that McCartney has said over and over that he absolutely hates. Denny Seiwell's drumming is a real bright spot on the album. Like Ringo, he always understands the assignment and never tries to pull focus, but at the same time fills out the otherwise thin sound with some really groovy tom fills and crackling energy. It was an honor to interview him. The track Mumbo is a super fun, jammy intro that gets pretty wild with all the vocal woos. It almost sounds like a Little Richard warm-up session. The song Love is Strange is a slinky highlight of the album. But even that's a cover. The title song Wildlife goes on way too long. As do a few other tracks on this album, like the song Dear Friend, which is Paul's attempt at a truce with John Lennon. An intriguing song, but again, just a bit too indulgent. The harmonies on this album, though, are all very sweet and occasionally hit that gorgeous early 70s tone that I just love. Like on the track Some People Never Know. Also on I Am Your Singer, a lovely and raw duet between Paul and Linda where you can really hear Linda finding her voice. I am your singer. The song Tomorrow is definitely the most robust of the bunch and the one that embodies the biggest strengths of the album with its delightful melody, romantic lyrics, gorgeous harmonies, and mellow homeliness. Wildlife may not be as musically accomplished or as complex as some of the previous albums in this list, but it's just got that early 70s charm that, even in its off moments, is still so interesting to hear Paul and his new band figure out who they are. There's a warmth to it that for me, even in its simplicity, will always be more enjoyable to listen to than the straightforward dad rock of the late 80s. Simply put, it's a bunch of stoned hippies making music for other stoned hippies. And yeah, it's pretty good. There's a quote from McCartney where he's talking about Picasso that I think will explain why this album shouldn't be written off. People say, well, his blue period was his only one that was any good. But for me, if the guy does some great things, then even his downer moments are interesting because they make up the final picture. So despite it being nowhere near as good as what preceded it, I think Wildlife gets Wings off to a fun, if shaky start, but one with plenty of potential. 6 out of 10. And that potential was explored further on their follow-up and the next album on our list, 1973's Red Rose Speedway. This was where, after Wildlife's lower than expected sales, it was decided that the group would now be called Paul McCartney and Wings, instead of just Wings. There's a lot of good buried in here, but so many of the tracks sound unfinished, or at the least unfleshed out. Red Rose Speedway was initially meant to be a double album encompassing many songs from the whole band, but instead it was cut down to a single disc. And I know the choices of what to cut from the album and what to include became a sore point for the band, as there are quite a few songs that were cut from here that are far superior than some that were included. Like how the hell did the track Loop First Indian on the Moon make the cut? Whereas if they had included the hit single Hi Hi Hi, this album would definitely be a few notches higher on this list. Hi 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 is one of Wings' biggest, most famous rockers that was banned from the BBC for its drug innuendo and sexually suggestive lyrics. The live Wings Over America version is the definitive one for me. And there was also that James Bond song that was released around the same time that's gone on to do pretty well. So what did pass muster and get included on this album? There's the Fleetwood Mac sounding Big Barn Bed, which is an inviting album opener, utilising more of that rustic country groove that we've come to know on the last few albums. Then there's the big hit single My Love, which I used to like quite a bit more than I do now. It's one of the first non-Beatles Paul McCartney songs I'd ever heard, and I always thought it had a kind of a nice slow groove and a real charm to it. Since then, I've heard many other Paul McCartney love songs that frankly just kick its ass. And I think now it's, even for me, a little too too cloying and simplistic. Also, after reading Rob Sheffield's take on the song in his brilliant book Dreaming the Beatles, which, side note, is my favorite Beatles book. This isn't a plug or anything, I just adore this guy's writing, and this book was honestly a bit of an inspiration for this YouTube channel. Anyway, in this chapter, he likens the song My Love to Paul McCartney trying and failing to emulate George Harrison's Something. And after reading that, I've never been able to hear the song the same way again. And in 1986, Paul went on to say it's his favorite Wings song. So I don't know, people, what do you think? Sound off in the comments. And hey, look, there are definitely some enjoyable moments on this album. The track Get On The Right Thing is camp, early 70s fun. One More Kiss is a sweet country song inspired by Paul putting his little kids to bed. And the harmonized La La La's at the end of Little Lamb Dragonfly are just heavenly. Then we get the more middle of the road tracks like Single Pigeon, which sounds very unfinished. We close with The Medley, which gets off to a slow start but eventually works its way into becoming my favorite track off the album. And look, it's easy to compare it to Abbey Road's incredible medley, which I would just recommend not doing. If you take it for what it is, it's got some really cool parts like the gated vocal on the Lazy Dynamite section. And then the switch to the irresistibly catchy Hands of Love part. I also understand that Linda's voice isn't perfect. In fact, she'd gone on to say that she was pretty out of tune on a lot of the early Wings albums. But man, I just love it so much. It's got a remarkably relaxed, dreamy tone that meshes beautifully with Paul's. She can also match him on all his silly mouth trumpet sounds. The vibe they give off is of two very playful lovers, and it's a charm that I will never be able to resist. 6.5 out of 10. Skipping ahead a few years, we arrive at Wings' final album, 1979's Back to the Egg, which sits right in the middle of the best to worst of Wings' discography for me. Great album artwork though. It's an album with, again, a lot of potential. It just doesn't really know what kind of album it wants to be. McCartney and the group should be commended for adopting new styles like punk on the track Spin It On. However, it's still Paul McCartney, so it's like punk but with fuzzy slippers on. We also get some of the most bombastic rock anthems in the entire Wingspan, like on Getting Closer, a rising rock track that gets the album off to a rollicking start. Also, the Rockestra theme is Paul McCartney's answer to what would happen if you got multiple guitarists, drummers, bass players, and put them all together to play a truly epic rock anthem.
Whereas most people use orchestras, the normal orchestra, I thought the idea might be good to use rock instruments instead and have what you could call a rockestra instead of an orchestra.
That, along with So Glad to See You Here, are just stellar rock tracks. One of my absolute standouts is the song Arrow Through Me. This is a rare pop inclusion amongst a fairly rock-led album. I mean, I say it's pop, but I don't know, it's kind of got this funky groove to it. The keyboard bass part, weird brass parts, and just really solid drumming from Steve Holley, whose style is a refreshing change to Paul, Ringo, or any drummer that McCartney's worked with prior. The issue is these rock anthems are placed haphazardly amongst these funk, R&B, and jazz songs, never quite capturing a consistent mood. And I usually love an eclectic mix of songs on a McCartney album, but here it's almost like the album is about to land on a theme before it changes direction and then goes back to the theme and changes direction again. There's also the super strange song The Broadcast, which isn't really a song, it's just a bunch of spoken word clips over some strange kind of piano that reminds me of something out of Mario 64.
It's the game that matters.
That was a very niche reference. Sorry, I know you're not here for my Nintendo videos. After all this over-the-top rock and other strange oddities, we close with a very simple jazz track, which, in my opinion, should stand alongside other acclaimed jazz standards. Baby's Request. It was originally written for the ancient jazz quartet The Mills Brothers, but complications saw Paul recording it for Back to the Egg.
Please play me my baby's request.
it's also where I can just start to see some age in Paul's voice. He's managed to stay very youthful sounding all throughout Wings, but here's where that late 30s vocal tone just starts to become a bit more noticeable, but only just. All in all, there's only a couple of songs that I don't really like. Everything's pretty enjoyable, and some of it's very enjoyable. And hey, what other LP sounds like both The Clash and the Mills Brothers on the same album? And if Paul had decided to include the incredible disco single Good Night Tonight, recorded around the same time, this album would be probably a couple notches higher on this list. 6.5 out of 10. Okay, so the next 8 albums all sit somewhere between a 7 and an 8 out of 10, so I'll be adjusting my grading system of whole and half numbers just for these next few. Next up is Pipes of Peace, Paul McCartney's first album released in his 40s. Some people write off this album as the scraps that was left over from his previous hit record, and although it may not be as good as that LP, it's still got an ambitious sound to it. A slightly experimental quality with lots of electronic nuances that layer on top of each other to create some seriously joyous and often very silly tracks. Beatles producer George Martin is once again at the helm, and Ringo Starr even plays drums on a couple of tracks. This is also the last album to feature core Wings member Denny Laine on either guitar or backing vocals, who'd been collaborating with Paul since 1971. The title track opens the album, and it's a pretty decent anti-war song, with panpipes and tabla, making it an enjoyable track, but one that sits very much in the early 80s. The song Say Say Say, often considered to be one of the best duets of all time, is a true highlight of the album. And this was a time where there were a lot of duets happening in pop music. Arguably Paul's most danceable song. It absolutely slaps, and I know it's like Michael Jackson. But damn, hearing their voices blend together while that irresistible beat plays underneath is just sublime. The 2015 remix from the archive version kicks it up a notch, extending it by 3 minutes and adding more robust modern production elements. It's a million times better than The Girl Is Mine from the Thriller album as well.
Yeah, she's mine.
You've got their other duet, The Man, which has got gorgeous pop harmonies but doesn't quite hit as hard as Say Say Say. The song The Other Me is a bit of a cheesy track with cheesy lyrics.
And I acted like a dustbin lid.
That I think, especially as its age, would sound just very glib and gooey by today's standards, but I don't know, it's just got a dorky 80s charm that I just really enjoy. Keep Undercover is my favourite track off the album. Paul doesn't often go for that slap bass sound, as many shouldn't, but here he subtly plays with the technique.
What good is butter if you haven't got bread?
And along with the staccato strings, does a great job of driving this very energetic song. Alright, new day of filming. The next track is So Bad. I mean, the track itself isn't bad, it's called So Bad. It's actually a pretty lovely song. It's got these really schmaltzy lyrics on a really schmaltzy melody. But again, if you've got this far in Paul McCartney's catalogue and you're surprised to hear a song all about loving a girl so bad, then I don't know what to tell you. Also, Ringo laying down some sweet drums underneath goes down very smoothly. Then the song Average Person is almost like a cartoonish Eleanor Rigby. A song about people going through their daily lives wishing to be someone else. With some of the daftest and silliest sound effects in any Paul McCartney song, and they're relentless. Like, it straight up sounds like Weird Al. Paul envisioned it as like a live kind of silly stage show number, and I think he captures that atmosphere on the track really well. It's so Weird Al. Then we have Tug of Peace, which is like a weird Zulu-inspired mashup of the title song Tug of War off Paul's previous album. Featuring various odd percussive and harmonic sounds, which is a cool production number from George Martin and Paul McCartney. It's almost like a precursor to the experimental electronic stuff he did as the Fireman and on Liverpool Sound Collage. Don't worry, I'll get to them after this list. The rest of the tracks range between the gentle Sweetest Little Show in Town and the instrumental Hey Hey, followed by the big love ballad that closes the album, Through Our Love. Look, it's not the album I would put on first to showcase Paul's talents, but I always enjoy listening to Pipes of Peace. There's nothing too heavy or melancholy here, which made a lot of people pass it off as lightweight, but to me this is Paul getting freaky recording in the Caribbean, having fun, furthering his love and talent of R&B, and creating his last really enjoyable album for more than 10 years. Paul definitely had playful moments after this album, but the level of silliness and absurdity that he frolicked around with on Pipes of Peace would not be heard again. 7 out of 10. Okay, next is 1997's Flaming Pie. This record saw McCartney's biggest gap between albums to date, 4 years. This is due in large part because after he recorded 93's Off the Ground, he spent years dedicated to assembling the Beatles anthology series. McCartney said that the anthology reminded him of the standards that the Beatles reach with their music. Quote, "So in a way, it was a refresher course that set the framework for the album." This is where Paul stopped worrying he'd sound like the Beatles and just fully embraced the sound he captured with the band, which is again why I refer to this period as the Beatles revivalist era. This was also the period where their sound became in vogue again. And now, thanks to the Britpop craze of the 90s, Paul was competing with bands who took direct inspiration from the Beatles like Oasis and Blur. The Beatles, despite being heralded as history's greatest band, were actually really cool again. It's where Paul's son James comes into his own and plays some lead guitar riffs on a couple songs, but also sadly the final album to feature Linda McCartney before she lost her battle with breast cancer the following year. Flaming Pie itself is pretty stripped back with no electronic production elements and more of a focus on the straightforward acoustic classic rock sound. The Songs We Were Singing is a lovely opener which has Paul harkening back to his days in the 60s, staying up late, drinking, smoking, chatting about the
Vast intricacies of life.
The song Some Days is a pretty somber track that Paul wrote in 2 hours while waiting for Linda to finish a cooking lesson. Calico Skies is by far the best song on the album. One he wrote before Off the Ground, it's one of his greatest songs he's ever written. Similar to another famous song of his, Blackbird, the lyrics are poignant and the sentiment behind it, a love song that turns into a 60s inspired anti-war song, shows the tremendous depth to McCartney's songwriting. To me, it's just a beautiful lullaby that I can listen to again and again and again and never grow tired of it.
I'll hold you for the rest of my life. I'll love you for as long as you like.
The title song Flaming Pie is a Lady Madonna sounding track with Jeff Lynne's ELO production sound.
Took my brains out and stretched.
Pretty boppy, pretty fun. The songs If You Wanna, Used to Be Bad, and Young Boy all feature Steve Miller. And apart from Young Boy, which is charming, the rest are pretty skippable. The song The World Tonight has a similar American rock aesthetic to it, which I get tired pretty quickly of on this record.
I can see the world tonight.
Really Love You is the first song ever credited to McCartney star, and sees Paul and Ringo, along with Jeff Lynne, improvise a rocking jam. It's 5 minutes long, but you get the picture after 40 seconds, but hey, it's two Beatles jamming, just shut up and enjoy. Beautiful Night is a song that Paul had been tinkering with for over 10 years, but when he finally laid it down, he really nailed it. He recruited Ringo Starr, Jeff Lynne, and in her final appearance on a Paul McCartney single, Linda. George Martin added an orchestral arrangement, and what starts out as a gentle piano number swells into a massive, uplifting, up-tempo euphoria. Hearing Ringo and Linda's voices singing back up in these last 2 minutes is enough to make you tear right up. And then we come right back down to a finger-picking, percussive song that sounds like an early Wings number, right down to the tone of the way it's recorded. Turns out that this song called Great Day is one Paul and Linda used to mess around with in their kitchen in the early 70s. Paul didn't change a single element of its original arrangement and got Linda to sing backup and George Martin to record it.
Oh no, it won't be long.
It's kind of like the songs Another Day or Hey Diddle, just a beautiful moment from my favorite McCartney period, Frozen in Time. I mean, thank goodness for Flaming Pie, as Paul's previous 3 records sit right at the bottom of this list. And then finally we get an album that, while definitely not perfect, is at least made up of half good to great songs, despite some generic rock thrown in the mix. It made it to number 2 in the charts in both the US and the UK, beaten only by Spice Girls' Spice. And you know what? Fair enough.
The album is Flaming Pie. You should check it out.
7.1 out of 10. Next up is McCartney 3. It feels really odd to include an album that came out less than a year ago, but that's McCartney for you. He never stops. Instead of headlining Glastonbury Festival, his original plans for 2020, Paul, like the rest of us, was stuck inside due to a certain global crisis. So he gathered his gear and tinkered with some songs he wasn't even sure was going to be an album.
I was completing songs just for my own fun, and eventually I had a lot of tracks finished. It's an album, maybe.
A few months later, after completing his songs in Rockdown, McCartney 3 was released and saw his first #1 album in his home country since 1989's Flowers in the Dirt, 31 years prior.
And a big thank you to everyone who helped get my record to #1. in the album charts. I got the award to prove it.
It also debuted at number 2 in the Billboard 200, which earned McCartney the feat of being the first artist to have a new album in the top 2 chart positions in each of the last 6 decades. This is the third installment to Paul's 2 other homemade albums where he records all the instrument himself.
And I realized, because I'd played everything on the album, just like McCartney 1 and McCartney 2, I realized, well, this is number 3 in the trilogy.
Instead of continuing the theme of creating one every 10 years, 1990, 2000, and 2010 never got their McCartney album. Instead, we all waited 40 years, but what finally emerged was worth the wait. The 5-minute, mostly instrumental Long-Tailed Winter Bird opens the album, and it's a great tone setter. McCartney just jamming this persistent guitar riff with his own energetic drum and bass underneath. It's clear we're listening to a new McCartney. The song Find My Way is a gutsy guitar rocker with a fantastic groove to it, with Paul alternating his bass sound between his Hofner and a Moog. I've heard the word Moog is actually pronounced Moog. I'm not sure. It feels wrong every time I say it. It's probably correct, but I'm just gonna keep saying Moog. Sorry, Robert Moog or Moog.
Moog.
Let's move on. Anyway, back to Find My Way. The lyrics are actually really poignant there for all the people dealing with anxiety at a very troubling time in the world. Pretty Boys is a pleasant song about the overbearingness of certain photographers to their male model subjects. I guess a bit of an odd topic for McCartney to be singing about at this stage in his life, but this song is my younger sister's favourite off the album, so it's certainly earned its place. The track Women and Wives sees Paul singing in this bluesy baritone and giving advice to the next generation.
Favorite song on this album, possibly a little song called Women and Wives.
It's a pretty decent, sobering number. The one song that I can give or take is Lavatory Lil. It's just a bit too generic, I usually skip it. However, the 8-minute 26-second Deep Deep Feeling is an epic, atmospheric track that totally absorbs and intoxicates the listener. There's tempo changes, key changes, vocal experimentation. Paul used his ancient Brunel quarter reel-to-reel tape recorder to layer these guitar parts and create what he called a guitar orchestra. Its effect is one of the most spacey and wonderful bits of eerie psychedelic music Paul's ever created. Seize the Day is a bit of a Beatley song written in response to the pandemic about making the most of what you've got. The Kiss of Venus is this quietly gorgeous track. Then we've got the track Winterbird / When Winter Comes, which uses the same guitar riff from the opening track, but then after 25 seconds it turns into When Winter Comes, and the first thing I noticed was the youthfulness in Paul's voice.
Must fix the fence by the acre plot.
Not quite Beatles youthful, but definitely not as old as he is now. And sure enough, When Winter Comes is a track he recorded way back in 1992, the same day actually he recorded Calico Skies. I like this song very much. It brings back a certain theme from McCartney's early solo and Wings albums, that of a simple farm life, fixing fences, planting trees, and warming your toes inside.
When summer's gone.
It was an unexpected end to the album, but I think it's actually a perfect choice. The provincial, homespun vibe of the original McCartney album gets revived right at the end here, making McCartney 3 come full circle and sees this trio of albums as intimate windows of 3 crucial points in McCartney's life.
Cool.
7.2 out of 10. Okay, halfway through the list now, and I'm just going to take a moment to say that if you're enjoying the video, please feel free to hit subscribe.
It just would be great. It's been my dream.
Give it a like if you want to. It'll really help the video get off the ground. And at the halfway point through the list, we arrive at 2007's Memory Almost Full. This was a title thought of by Paul after seeing the words pop up on his phone, and he thought it summed up modern life. This is the first album of Paul's that I actually remember coming out. I always thought the singles were fun, but when I listened to the rest of the album recently, I was struck by how not only eclectic, but also thematic it was. It's brighter and poppier than Paul's been in decades. It's almost like a Wings album. It opens with a catchy Ever-Present Past, a heavily processed rock song where, even though it sounds pretty electronic, there's also a Beatle quality in the tone, as the instruments, right down to the guitar amp, were once used by the Beatles. It also establishes the mood of the album, which is the retrospective approach of remembering and reminiscing.
I hit upon this idea of my past, never been able to escape it from, say, the Beatle days. But then it kind of got into when I was a kid, and that far back, and that, element of my past.
And just essentially examining the sheer amount of stuff he's done in his life. Dance Tonight is a simple but catchy foot stomper that sees Paul using the mandolin for the first time. The song Only Mama Knows starts off with these very dramatic strings before it launches right into something that sounds like a Wings song. It is the heaviest Paul has rocked in years. The track See Your Sunshine is a love song to Heather Mills, despite the couple being broken up by the time this album was released. The track Gratitude sees Paul bring back his Little Richard pipes. We also see the return of the medley, not seen since Red Rose Speedway, as he launches into the track Vintage Clothes. A fun, up-tempo song about not living in the past with some playful lyrics and some very 2007 whistling. It also brings back the same mellotron from Strawberry Fields Forever, even using the same flute setting. The medley continues on That Was Me, a bluesy rocker that sees Paul reflecting back on all these major moments of the earlier period of his life. This is a cool track. It sounds like something off Ram. The rock and roll then breaks off into Feet in the Clouds, a dreamy song where Paul looks back on his dysfunctional time at school. It includes an exciting use of synth and these overlapping harmonies like we haven't heard since the early 80s.
I just wanted to kind of go robotic on some harmonies.
The medley then comes to a rousing climax on House of Wax. The lyrics from this track are very poetic to me.
It's like the scene of a war. There's sort of an anti-war feeling in that song.
And also has Paul delivering one of his most searing guitar solos he has ever recorded, full stop. The song builds and builds before Paul's vocal and the guitar solo reach this just epic zenith. And then the track, The End of the End, really caught me off guard the first time I heard it. This actually has Paul not looking back, but looking ahead as he sings about the day that he dies and how he wants to be remembered and celebrated.
On the day that I die, I'd like jokes to be told.
It's really moving, and it sounds like it's him at the end of his life, but of course, he has gone on to record 3 more studio albums, plus more, after this album. Memory Almost Full ends as it begins, with a foot stomper called Nod Your Head. I should call it a head nodder. I know why Paul included this at the end so as to not leave the album on such a solemn note after what we just heard, but I feel like it almost undermines the richness of The End of the End, with Nod Your Head's simplistic command of nodding up, nodding down.
Nod it up! Nod it down!
Some of these songs were recorded only a couple years after my least favorite Paul album, Driving Rain. I mean, both albums even utilize the same producer, but something must have really clicked with Paul in the early to mid 2000s. Maybe it's the emergence of the indie rock sound that was coming out of this decade, but whatever it is, his sense of fun is definitely back. He's not on autopilot recording toothless dad rock. Honestly, it's nice to know that a recent divorce did nothing to bring down his spirits. Instead, he finds a balance of harking back to days of old, not only with the lyrical content, style, and sound, but also finding new inventive musical ideas that he plays half by himself and the other half of the tracks are played with his band. This is definitely his most youthful album since Pipes of Peace 24 years prior. While there's no song that's the absolute standout, its strength lies in its consistency and cohesiveness. There's really not a single song on here that I don't like. 7.3 out of 10. Our next album is another lovely modern surprise from Paul McCartney, 2013's New. After Memory Almost Full, Paul recorded an album of jazz standards called Kisses on the Bottom to scratch that old classics itch. 1 year later, he released New, the first album of his 70s, and also the longest gap between studio albums, 6 years. It couldn't be a more befitting title, as these songs feature some of the most modern and exciting sounds we've ever heard from Paul. It's also the first studio album since McCartney married Nancy Chevelle, so a new sense of love and romance is in the air. I think it's a natural successor to Memory Almost Full, which was also full of fresh musical ideas, but New takes it to new heights. Part of the newness of New is the 4 relatively young, extremely successful producers. Paul Epworth, who had a buzz around him at the time for producing Adele's insanely successful 21 album, kicks off with a cracking start on the up-tempo Save Us. It's got a real indie rock vibe. It's half Strokes, half Muse. Epworth also produced the rocking and energetic Queenie Eye, which has this super catchy chant shaped from
a street game we used to play in Liverpool when I was a kid.
Mark Ronson, most known at the time for producing Amy Winehouse's Back to Black and for DJing Paul and Nancy's Wedding. He produces 2 tracks off the album, including the murky and mysterious Alligator, complete with Kanye-level vocal effects. But his big number, and one of my favorites, is the title track, New. This is essentially Mark Ronson taking a song written by Paul and turning it into his his very own Beatles track. It's a bit of Got to Get You Into My Life, a little bit of Penny Lane. It features this irresistibly catchy harpsichord melody that playfully bounces along for the whole track.
I never knew what I could be, what I could do.
It's also a love song for his new wife Nancy, which makes it very recognisably McCartney. The carnival-like cascade of different Paul harmonies at the end bending into the final note makes this one of McCartney's most Beatles-sounding songs of his entire solo career. Then we've got the man heralded for his work on the early Kings of Leon albums, Ethan Johns, who crafts a lot of the more down-tempo acoustic cuts, such as the sobering Hosanna and the atmospheric closer Road. But Ethan Johns' standout song with McCartney has got to be the evocative Early Days. This is a very introspective and revealing song from Paul. Even his vocal take shows his age and slight imperfections.
I lived through those early days.
Upon hearing the initial vocal take of the song, McCartney wanted to redo it because he was self-conscious, but Ethan Johns convinced him to keep it because of how raw and real it sounds. I'm really glad he convinced him, because after hearing McCartney's voice go through so many vocal effects on this album, it's a really welcome change to just hear his voice as it is, front and center. This is a song that cuts between the verses in the form of Paul remembering the early times of him and John getting started as songwriters, and the chorus, which is Paul setting the record straight on who did what and when by reminding us that he actually lived through those early days. You might think it unnecessary that Paul feels the need to defend himself, but it must be hard for him to watch the narrative of the Beatles legend and John Lennon being reinterpreted and editorialized without Paul really being able to do anything about it. I personally think this is a companion song to Here Today. They're both basically about John Lennon. Here Today was written after John's death about what he would say to Paul if he could, and Early Days, written 30 years later, is about what people have been saying about them both ever since. They also both contain the lyrics, "But as for me," when talking retrospectively about John and his memory.
But as for me,
And finally, we have the son of Beatles producer George Martin, Giles Martin, who produced 6 tracks. Martin had already proved his worth handling a Beatles songs on the Cirque du Soleil Love album. He's since produced the 50th anniversaries of Sgt. Pepper, The White Album, and Abbey Road, which are all marvelous in my opinion. Here he works with McCartney on My Way to Work, about Paul's memories working as a second man on a bus. I think this is the one job he had before being in the Beatles. It's really charming and reminds me of that theme of reminiscing that was so prevalent on Memory Almost Full. I will say that there are these like stompy rock parts that just come out of nowhere, which to me just sound like a beer ad or a 4-wheel drive commercial. Things then get low and moody on the song Appreciate, which sounds more like something off his last experimental Fireman album. Then we've got Everybody Out There, which is a song that feels like it was specifically made for live shows with its easy to remember chant and woes. Paul even called his tour from that period Out There, so go figure. There's a wingsy synth solo on I Can Bet, and some stabby acid house synths on Looking at Her. But neither song are really standouts to me. So that's new, and to be honest, I think the fact that it cracks my top 10 in this list really speaks to the fantastic work Paul continues to do in his older age. And remember, working with this many young hotshot producers was certainly a risk. The last time Paul ganged up with a team of producers this extensive was Flowers in the Dirt, which I think now suffers from sounding too stuck in the time period it was recorded in. Maybe that'll happen here, but as for me, I'm really glad Paul went out and made an album like this. At 70 years old, he definitely has nothing left to prove in terms of his talent, and he could have easily picked a lane in the 90s and stuck with it, but instead, he created an imaginative, poppy, very youthful album. I suppose while it's still relatively appropriate for him to do one. I dig it. 7.4 out of 10. Alright, time to dive right back into the 70s with Wings at the Speed of Sound. 2 words that sum up why I love this album: bass lines. Paul's creamy bass playing is super prominent on nearly every track, which was intentional as he was attempting to make this album more danceable, meaning its Wings flirting with a little bit more disco this time. This album is also the first where Paul decided to be very diplomatic and bestow lead vocal privileges to each member of the 5-piece band. with Paul singing 5 songs, Denny Lane singing 2, and Joe English, Jimmy McCulloch, and Linda singing 1 each, with Linda duetting another with Paul. The bass-heavy tone of the album kicks off on Let 'Em In, which has this very groovy flow to it with a simple repeating bass line on both piano and bass guitar. The marching drum beat also helps give it character, as does the fake fade out, which is just such an inventive inclusion. The song The Note You Never Wrote features Denny Lane on lead vocals, but is a bit of a dirge. And then the song She's My Baby, that's one of my favorites off the album. The whole thing runs off a very simple bass line, drum beat, and some organ flourishes. It's just got a certain satisfying simplicity and irresistible groove that you can't help nodding your head to. Then the song Beware My Love is the one true rock track off the album, and it's a huge number. With some stunning, escalating vocals from McCartney. Again, the live version absolutely slays.
Got you better beware my love, baby.
Then we get to one of Paul's career-defining numbers, Silly Love Songs. To me, this is the best track on the album by far, and one of the best he's ever written, full stop. The song is a massive fuck you to everyone, including John Lennon, who would always ridicule Paul's sentimental romantic music as just lightweight fluff. And here's McCartney showing everyone that, hey, people like love songs. You may hate the track My Love, but the song was Paul's biggest hit in years. Silly Love Songs also has one of McCartney's greatest bass lines, which is really saying something. Hold on, one sec. So yeah, you get it. Like, just watch him singing and playing bass at the same time here in this live clip.
You think that people would have had enough of silly love song?
Just completely mesmerizing. The build-up of multiple vocal parts sung in counterpoint, which was inspired by the overlapping harmonies in God Only Knows, are just magical. Critics were shook and had to hand it to McCartney that he made a great song that went on to become a massive hit. Then on the song Cook of the House, we get Linda's lead vocal debut. And I can never tell if I think it's charming, a bit awkward, or just bad. Time to Hide is Denny Lane's song, which he wrote and sung for the album, which is, in a word, fine. Must Do Something About It is a McCartney song sung by drummer Joe English, which is perfectly enjoyable, as is the next song, San Fairy Ann. The song Warm and Beautiful is the album closer, and also one of Paul's most divisive love ballads. Some, like Elvis Costello, call this one of Paul's most beautiful songs he's ever written. Others consider it to be his worst song ever, full stop. I am definitely in the former camp. I adore this track. It nearly tips into the overly sentimental column, but it's saved by Paul's sincerity and his masterful use of melody, making this a favorite cut off the album for me. So with Wings at the Speed of Sound, while having everyone contribute their own songs certainly makes this album something of the definitive Wings album, but it also means that when it hits hard, but when it misses, well, let's just say this album is a little uneven. It's got some of my all-time favorite Paul McCartney songs on it, but it's also got tracks like Wino Junko and Cook of the House, which, while great that we're hearing a collaborative effort, it doesn't make for the most consistent record. Still, a very enjoyable and danceable time nonetheless.
Oh, I really like Wings. They're just fantastic.
7.5 out of 10. Claiming our number 8 spot on the list is the very first solo McCartney album, aptly titled McCartney. The first time I heard this record, I can remember feeling disappointed that Paul didn't match the talents of George and John on their first post-Beatles output, but the McCartney album has since aged like a fine wine for me. This is the one album of Paul's that was written and recorded while the Beatles were still a band. Paul used these McCartney sessions as a kind of an escape from the incredibly tense atmosphere that was the final months of the Beatles. What I really wasn't hearing the first few times I listened to this record a few years ago was Paul's deep need to break free as a solo artist, whatever it was that sounded like at the time. The first track, The Lovely Linda, is Paul literally making up something on the spot as Linda walks into the room while he's testing out his home recording gear. But even this is so goddamn charming. The track ending with that cheeky little giggle of his. There's something about that strip-back approach that just makes you marvel at how, on a song like That Would Be Something, McCartney creates a rhythm section out of very little percussion, some scatty vocal additions, and that melodic bass that fills out the rhythm like only McCartney can do. There's tracks that he made up on the spot, Valentine Day and Ooh You, which are still really charming. Ooh You especially is just full of soul and charisma. Every Night is one of Paul's most sincere, beautiful love songs about domestic bliss. It's one of those tracks on here where even though Paul's life is crumbling around him, he knows he's got Linda and their own beautiful life together that they can hide away to, a theme that reoccurs on the next few albums as well. Every Night is just that song I can put on when I've cancelled some plans and I know I'm going to have a nice night in with the person that I love. It's heaven. Even the track Hot as Sun brings this guitar riff that Paul wrote way back in the late 1950s and underlays it with this super chill mellotron. It sounds amazing. The glasses section of this track is also disarmingly experimental and weird, in keeping with Paul's love for the avant-garde. You've also got a few songs here that the Beatles rejected, like Junk and Teddy Boy, which are enjoyable enough. Junk is actually just a song made up of words that McCartney thinks sound really nice on the ear. Like his favourite word is candlestick. It's got a musicality to it. Candlestick. Candlestick. And then we have perhaps Paul's most beloved song of his entire career. Maybe I'm Amazed, about his undying love and appreciation for Linda. This is the one song that wasn't recorded in McCartney's home studio and thus has a much richer, fuller sound. There's nothing about the song that could possibly be improved. McCartney absolutely goes for broke on the vocal, the organ is packed full of soul, and the guitar solo is as searing as ever. Even though this album is very homespun and feels very spur of the moment a lot of the time, there's still plenty of eclecticism in all the stripped backness. It's a real window into his own inner turmoil at the time, and is a perfect example of Paul's unfiltered lo-fi brilliance. Doing a lot with very little, basically. While George was finding God and John was expunging his demons, Paul was just here to remind us how much of a romantic and brilliant musician he was. It's pure McCartney. 7.6 out of 10. Next up is my second favourite Wings album from 1975, Venus and Mars. This album is one of McCartney's most successful at capturing a real sense of atmosphere. It's like a rock and roll show in space. It's got love songs, classic Paul McCartney granny music, as John Lennon would call it, Pink Floydian rockers, and irresistible pop. This was the period of the mid-70s where synths were just starting to become better utilised in music, and right before they got their cheesy, awkward phase in the latter half of the 70s. Venus and Mars and Rock Show has got to be one of my favourite openings on any Paul McCartney album. Here he's riding high off the success of Wings' previous album and going for broke with a pair of songs that act as a perfect sensory opening to a real rock show, to which McCartney perfectly timed with one of the most successful tours in rock and roll history. And that use of blazing 70s synths at the end of Rock Show is just too good. Even with a track like Love in Song, which is not one of my favourites of the album, but it still does a very good job at capturing this very specific mood with lots of spacey synths and longing vocals from Paul. And then when things get uber McCartney on You Gave Me the Answer, it's still very charming. I've used the word charming a lot. I guess that's Paul McCartney. This track is like a perfect mix of Martha My Dear and When I'm 64.
You gave me the answer to love eternal.
These music hall numbers are often no one's favourite, but you can tell McCartney loves them so much and are so special to him because of his father's musical influence. Things pick up again with Magneto and Titanium Man.
It's about 3 comic book strip cartoon characters,
where McCartney shows us, of all things, his love for Marvel Comics. It's a boppy rocker. It's good. The track Letting Go is a song that dances between love and obsession. It's just got this very cool bluesy tune the whole way through. The live version of the song goes off. I also like the reprise of Venus and Mars better than the opener. It's got a more appropriately cosmic feel to it. I love those added effects, those synth noises, the crazy overlapping harmonies towards the end of the track gives it so much drama and mystery. I love it. The song Spirits of Ancient Egypt is a bit more of a lull for me, with Denny Lane's vocals just not cutting it compared to McCartney's. However, the song Medicine Jar, written and sung by young guitarist Jimmy McCulloch, absolutely rocks. This kid was 11 years younger than McCartney and creates just a rollicking song which is very reminiscent of Pink Floyd's Money. It's my favourite Wings song that isn't written or sung by Paul. The song Call Me Back Again is a bit of a slower soul number, but one that perfectly showcases McCartney's insane vocals. Like, compared to so many contemporary male singers, there's just no competition. Like, if you heard this song on, I don't know, The Voice or something, you'd be beyond blown away. The song Listen to What the Man Said is a real favourite off the album for me. It's just really bright and joyous, paired wonderfully with backing vocals from Linda. This is 70s pop at its finest. The album closes with a track that you can sway along to as you hold your lighter up. Treat her gently, lonely old people. Venus and Mars moves along at a cracking pace and barely lets up the entire way. They absolutely nailed it with the singles, and it's also got one of my favorite Paul McCartney album covers. Just a brilliant nugget of 70s rock. The wonder of it all, baby. 7.7 out of 10. We're now moving into the beginning of the 80s with the album that kickstarted my second favourite McCartney period. Among Paul McCartney's albums that were hated at the time but have since risen to cult status, inspiring countless future musicians, McCartney 2 stands near the top of that pile. For an artist that was insistent on doing something different on every album, here he goes for something that's so far out from his usual stuff, sometimes you gotta check what you're listening to make sure it's still him. It's like there's Paul McCartney albums, and then there's McCartney 2. This is where, after Paul got done for cannabis possession in Japan while they were on what turned out to be their final tour as Wings, he went back to his home studio on his Glasgow farm, hired some newfangled synth and sequencer gear, and went berserk.
Originally just went into the studio to have a mess around, because I was fed up of formally making records, you know, going in and doing it all properly. I wanted to just hire a machine, a 16-track machine, and just put a microphone into the back, so it's a very primitive way of doing it. She was like a glorified cassette recorder.
What's happened to Wings?
Wings still hadn't technically broken up by this point, but they weren't to release any more studio albums after Back to the Egg. So this is a collection of songs that, similar to McCartney, he had no initial intention of releasing as an album.
In the end, I played it to a couple of people, and they said, "That's your next album, isn't it?" I said, "No, not really, it's just for my own amusement." They said, "No, that's your next album."
It opens with a track Paul had been playing live on his last Wings tour, Coming Up.
Like a flower, coming up.
Which to me is one of his all-time greatest songs. Every time it starts, no matter how many times I've heard it, my first thought is always, oh great, someone's put on Talking Heads. Like that very new wave guitar strumming at the start. Until you realize, no, this is Paul McCartney. He even put his voice through a Varispeed tape machine, which enabled it to be sped up and then put through an echo machine to give it that extra strange quality. That steadily climbing funk bass line, those muted guitars. It's also the song that John Lennon heard that made him want to start making music again after a 5-year drought. In fact, when he heard it for the first time on our car radio, he said, "Fuck a pig, that's Paul!" The song Temporary Secretary is a manic electronic fever dream, and I love it.
Temporary secretary.
Hearing Coming Up and then Temporary Secretary one after the other really makes you go, who am I listening to?
She can be a belly dancer, I don't need a true romancer.
That unhinged sequencer noise that plays throughout is pretty abrasive, but this track laid some of the groundwork of the sort of electronic music we'd continue to hear throughout the 80s. And this specific track is an inspiration of many notable DJs who brought this song back into their live sets into the new millennium.
Definitely experiment with anything, you know, just any little noise I wanted to do. This was going to be total freedom.
The song On the Way is another echoey, lo-fi blues song that's got a pretty slick groove to it. The other single, Waterfalls, is one that I used to find pretty irritating, but now the sound of those primitive electronic strings has really grown on me.
Sort of deep fans know that one.
It's actually a song with really beautiful advice that Paul said he couldn't have written 20 years prior. McCartney's vocal tone is quite different and strange, like nothing we've heard before.
And I need love.
Which is kind of a theme on the album. He's not just being experimental with instruments and machines or lyrics and chords, he's trying out different spaces within his own voice. We then shake off the slightly melancholy hypnosis that Waterfalls puts us in with the song Nobody Knows, where we hear Paul play an up-tempo bluesy stomper. We get a couple of instrumental electronic tracks with the curious and playful front parlor. And also the song, which is titled Frozen Japanese in Japan. Its title is shortened in the Western versions, but out of respect for the Japanese, who consider this word to be a slur against them, I will not be using it. Paul was going for a certain vibe with this track and had a working title of
Crystalline Wonder around Mount Fuji, or Snow-Capped Fuji, you know, it might have been called, or something like that.
I will say that it's a pretty decent electronic track and really does evoke that atmosphere that Paul was describing in the video. A lot of these kind of tracks remind me of the stuff that Japanese electronic artist Haruomi Hosono was creating at the same time. Bogey Music, which was inspired by this guy, is a bit of a weird and wobbly 12-bar blues track. The song Dark Room creates a very freaky atmosphere with some of Paul's wildest vocals. Then we close with One of These Days, which I think is one of Paul's, and I really often don't like using this term, but underrated acoustic tracks. An incredibly peaceful and calming message, so simply played with just some added reverb on his still very youthful and sweet vocals.
And breathe fresh air ever after.
He wrote and recorded it after a, quote, Hare Krishna bloke came around to see him and was very nice and gentle, as Paul put it, which then carried on into the recording, and you can really hear it. I also have to point out that McCartney 2 isn't craft work. Paul's not innovating sound quite to that level. Rather, he succeeds in the sheer fearlessness of his own creation. There's a reckless freedom to McCartney 2 that the 1970 McCartney doesn't quite achieve. I can see why people were absolutely bewildered by this in 1980, but now it's quite highly regarded as one of the most significant albums of its time, and electronic acts like Hot Chip have called it hugely influential on their sound. Paul's since gone on to say that if he wanted to do something that experimental again, he'd save it for his underground electronic duo, The Firemen, but this one managed to slip by amongst his core catalogue, and for that I am very grateful. 8 out of 10. After 36 years since Paul's last #1 album in the US, in comes Egypt Station to debut atop the Billboard 200. A #1 album at the ripe old age of 76. See kids? You keep working hard and eventually you'll make it. Not that Paul had literally anything to prove at this point, but in the year 2018, he just so happened to have made one of the best albums of his career. As one of my favourite rock and roll writers, Rob Sheffield, said of the album, make a list of all the songwriters who were composing great tunes in 1958. Now make an overlapping list of the ones who are still writing brilliant songs in 2018. Your list reads, Paul McCartney. So what else does McCartney have left in the tank? An hour-long album with some of the ballsiest songs Paul's ever made. Egypt Station, produced by Greg Kurstin, plays out like a long cosmic train ride where you can hop off into one of the many unique and exciting songs off the album, which opens with the ambient sound of a train station before it segues into a sustained note from this heavenly choir. We then hear McCartney's voice on the second track, I Don't Know, and he definitely sounds older now, which makes the opening words, I've got crows at my windows, dogs at my door, even more poignant and self-aware. It's got this beautiful, somber, piano-led melody, and I love that the song that opens the album is one where Paul's admitting that he's not perfect, and still, after all these years, even he doesn't know.
Why am I going wrong? I don't know.
He doesn't have all the answers to his problems or the world's problems. It's wonderfully introspective. We pick ourselves up on the rocking and flirtatious Come On To Me, where McCartney proves to us quickly that he's not some old geezer. It's got a solid groove to it and is just another easy hit for live shows. The track Happy With You is a beautiful acoustic number that musically could have come from any decade, but lyrically it's written from an older, wiser point of view. It's confessional from the get-go with the opening lyrics,
I sat around all day. I used to get stoned.
I like to get wasted, but these days I don't, cause I'm happy with you. I mean, it's not like he talks about it much in interviews, but it's pretty widely known that McCartney was a regular cannabis smoker for most of his life. Not anymore, not since having grandkids, but still, it's pretty shocking hearing him just admit it in this song. I mean, not for other writers, but for Squeaky Clean McCartney, and as old as he is. But maybe that's just him in his late 70s, to be like, yeah, I used to smoke weed. I really love it. It's really a delightful song, and one of my favourites off the LP. We then snap right into the track Who Cares? A punchy rock song which sees Paul reaching out to anyone who's been bullied, and he lets them know that he's in their corner. It's got a really catchy hook. I like it. Then we get to maybe the only song that I think Paul went a little too young pop star on. The song For You. It's also the fault of the producer of this particular song, Ryan Tedder of One Republic, who's written and produced for the likes of Taylor Swift and Ed Sheeran. It's just a little too generic contemporary pop, and the lyrics, I just wanna fuck you, is meant to have a cheeky double meaning like I just want it for you, but also I just want to f you. I know it's something the Beatles used to do back in their day, like on Day Tripper, the lyrics she's a big teaser was often heard as she's a prick teaser, which is cute and charming in your 20s but a little creepy in your 70s. However, the song Confidant is another absolute favourite of mine. Paul wrote this as a tribute to, of all things, his guitar. And no, it's not a song about masturbation as many thought. I guess it can be a little confusing when you look at the lyrics. It's about Paul realising that he hasn't played his guitar in a while, and when he was young it used to be like his best friend. That one that stood with him always and listened to his every secret word. Like many tracks off the album, it's very vulnerable and very touching. Then on the track People Want Peace, we've got Paul's unifying anthem, inspired by him visiting Palestine and performing in Israel.
This candle is for peace. especially Israel, Palestine.
It's a real foot stomper and would be a great live number, but he's never performed it to a crowd, weirdly. Dominoes is a cool song with a decent groove and leaves the listener pretty disarmed on McCartney's last line.
It's been a blast.
I'm not liking that past tense, Paul. Back in Brazil is a song that was recorded in Brazil, funnily enough. See, I do my research.
I'm in Brazil, I'm feeling the spirit, looking out at Sao Paulo, thinking about all the Brazilian people who are out there and the way the Brazilians love music.
It's a bit of a strange track with a kind of a loungy electro samba groove, but one that I like the more and more I listen to it. The track Do It Now is probably the most rousing anti-procrastination song you'll ever hear. Then we get to Paul's most, well, I think anyway, successful political song of his career, despite repeated warnings. Hey, remember this video?
Since the 60s, in my view, nothing much has happened.
Well, now it's 2018, and a fair few things have happened since the 90s. Smack bang in the middle of Brexit, devastating climate change effects, and of course, the Trump administration. It's an epic song in the same vein as Band on the Run or Live and Let Die, where it's made up of 3 or 4 different parts, but all built around the same similar theme. Obviously, no real names are mentioned, but it's undoubtedly targeting Trump. There's even this part where he's singing about how the captain has the best crew on the planet, and then Paul goes, "The best crew on the planet!" I mean, all he needed to do was this and move over Alec Baldwin. When I first heard this song, I was strangely reassured by Paul. Not because I think he can actually enact any political change, but because it was comforting to hear this guy who's seen it all not turn his back on the next generation and stand up for what he believes in through his music. I mean, he's proven to us that he's a huge climate change activist. He went to the March for Our Lives rally and protested gun violence.
One of my best friends was killed in gun violence right around here, so it's important to me.
Dude's a champ. And then the track ends optimistically because it's Paul, so of course, with McCartney chanting, "Yes, we can do it now. Yes, we can do it.
Yes, we can do it. Yeah, we can do it now.
God love the man, honestly. Then bringing us back to the theme, we have the track Station 2, which takes us back to the train station and that heavenly choir. Before we get to the last track on the album, the 3-song medley of Hunt You Down, Naked, and Sea-Link. Bloody loves a medley, that Paul McCartney. Hunt You Down starts us off with a cowboy-tinged Prince-inspired rocker, which then moves from 4/4 into 3/4 time on Naked, which has one of my favorite confessional lyrics from the album, "I've been naked since I was born." And it's like, yeah, this guy's been on display since he was a teenager. Egypt Station definitely has some similarities to New from 5 years prior. There's plenty of songs that feel like they're designed for stadiums. There's also plenty of harpsichord, which gives it a distinctly Beatles sound. But I think where New almost felt like McCartney was giving some songs to some hotshot producers and getting a really fun result, Egypt Station is McCartney through and through. This album came out when I was 27, the same year Paul was when the Beatles broke up. And it just makes me marvel that after all these years, he's still making albums this good. Not because the record label's telling him to, not because he needs the cash, but because it's just something he really loves to do. He loves writing songs, he loves plugging in an electric guitar to an amp and hearing the sound. It's beautiful, it's Paul, it's Egypt Station. 8 out of 10. Lighting change, it's a new day. This video is taking me much longer than I thought. Landing in 4th place is McCartney's mid-2000s masterpiece, Chaos and Creation in the Backyard. This is the album that Paul McCartney released after my least favorite album of his, Driving Rain. So I was pretty concerned that this was just going to be another predictable Macca album without any bite, but I was so surprised and delighted by what I heard. The secret ingredient of this 2005 gem is producer Nigel Godrich, most known as the production wizard behind every Radiohead album.
I knew I wanted to work with Nigel Godrich, but I didn't know who he was, except I'd heard Radiohead, so I knew I liked the sound he got.
He had a different approach with McCartney. He warned Paul that he, quote, liked what he liked and would tell him when he thought something was crap. This happened a few times. On the first day of recording with Paul's band, Nigel wasn't digging the vibe and actually sent them away. He also pushed back on several songs and insisted Paul try another tack or in some cases drop them altogether.
So the two of us, gave our opinions and became very honest with each other. He had a very firm opinion about what he wanted to make.
This may have seemed harsh, but I think after years of people deferring to Paul's every musical choice just because of who he is, he needed someone who would disagree and challenge him. And I think initially Paul was a bit taken aback by this, but then soon came to appreciate what Nigel was doing for him. Because what we get is one of McCartney's most daring and intimate albums to date. It's the first album he made in his 60s, and it's just full of new musical ideas that surprise the listener at every turn. What is immediately noticeable about Chaos and Creation is that none of the music is what you'd call rock and roll. I guess not in the traditional McCartney McCartney sense anyway. Many of the songs are piano-led and have a stripped-back vulnerability about them. I think this only heightens the intrigue of the sound as it opens up other possibilities with some really unique musical choices.
Slightly offbeat instrumentation that I think gives it a world of its own.
A quirky accent of sound begins the album as the song Fine Line launches into some up-tempo piano with plenty of energy, exuberance, and some really nicely arranged strings that just slide in and out until the whole track crashes to a halt at the end. It's his best opener in years. The song How Kind of You starts off with this low harmonium drone and twinkling accents of piano before it turns into this dreamy, almost 60s kind of thing.
We got this idea to create a bed, like a sort of ocean bed of sounds using little tape loops.
Paul says it reminds him of The Doors, and I think with Nigel Godrich helming the production, especially towards the end, the track sounds like a cut from a Radiohead album. In fact, I can hear quite a bit of Hail to the Thief on here, Radiohead's album from 2 years prior. The track Jenny Wren is a gentle but haunting, finger-plucked ballad a la Blackbird, with strange chord progressions and an even stranger sound as we hear the first use in popular music of the Armenian woodwind instrument, the duduk. It is a gorgeous piece. We then hear the track Friends to Go, one of my favourite later era Paul McCartney songs. This track actually has a great story behind it. McCartney was mid-composition on the song before he realised that it was sounding like something that George Harrison could have written.
Somehow I felt like it was a George song.
And then he said he felt George's spirit as he wrote the rest of the song. He said it practically finished itself because it wasn't even him writing it. I definitely hear it too. It's got a certain bitchy folk feel to it with some very Beatles-esque backing vocals from Paul towards the end.
Been waiting on the other side for your friends to go.
I guess in a way this is a kind of a tribute to George, who died only 4 years prior. If you got a bot to listen to 1,000 hours of Paul McCartney music and then got it to write its own song, it would probably sound a little something like the next track, English Tea. That's not meant to be a dig on the song, it's really quite wonderful. Once again, it's a piano-led number and the most self-referential Paul's been since Silly Love Songs, as he sings about English tea and miles of English garden. To borrow a lyric from the song, it's Paul being
Very twee, very me.
The playful recorders plus Paul's extremely British lyrics harken back to McCartney's most granny music he's ever done, and I couldn't be happier. The whimsy that's been lost for years is now back. The string arrangement on this track, in fact on the whole album, veers away from the sentimental, saturated strings of previous McCartney records, and instead dips in and out of the mix, making the sound more intentional and atmospheric. Another standout for me is the song Too Much Rain. The lyrics are incredibly stirring and are designed to help anyone who's been through pain and rough times, which since losing his first wife and being mid-divorce on his next one, we know Paul definitely has been. I can't help but listen to these lyrics and imagine it as a kind of emotional reminder to himself. His voice reaches a gentle and beautiful falsetto in the chorus, and I'm moved every time I hear it.
Too much rain.
The track Riding to Vanity Fair is the most genuinely pissed off Paul sounded in maybe ever. And it's not forced, it's not angry from press to play. It's not even obvious he's annoyed at first, as the song has an almost dreamlike, mysterious quality to it. Sort of feels like a conversation or a relationship that's kind of breaking down, two people that just aren't communicating properly. Paul's never said it's about Heather, but given their relationship was falling apart at the time, well, I drew my own conclusions. I will say the album tapers off just slightly towards the end with tracks like Follow Me and Promise to You Girl, which are still quality, but along with the track anyway, the back end of this album loses a little bit of steam in terms of energy, but still retains wonderful instrumentation, lyrics, and intention. In fact, there's an instrumental hidden track right at the end called I've Only Got Two Hands, and the last minute and a half of this is another example of that Radiohead vibe coming on really strong as it closes out the LP. It's usual to listen to a Paul McCartney album and wonder about the meaning or inspiration behind the song, but on Chaos and Creation in the Backyard, I find myself wondering more about Paul as a person, especially during this time, if he was okay, what it is he was feeling during this period. I don't know, I feel for him on this record. When I was going through his albums chronologically, Chaos and Creation was the first Paul McCartney album that I listened to that didn't feel like it was really of its time. It could have been recorded last year, it's that timeless. It continues the trend that Flaming Pie started and sees Paul sounding the most Beatle-like since the band broke up, a trend that would continue throughout the next 10 years of his recordings. I think side side 1 on this record is one of his absolute best first sides on any of his albums. Before the actual McCartney 3 came out, many nicknamed this McCartney 3 due to Paul playing nearly every instrument on the album.
He wanted to make an album that was very me. He was vibing back to things like an album called McCartney, which was very homemade, but he wanted to visit that area again. It's kind of got an organic feel to it, the album, because of that.
I genuinely think this is some of the most confessional music Paul's ever created. He still has that old habit of masking the intention behind his lyrics, but his emotions absolutely tumble out on this record.
You know, we came in with a load of chaos and a load of bits and pieces of songs and ideas, created something out of it, and because it's a little bit homemade, the album, I did a lot of the playing, then that sort of fits with the In the Backyard thing.
And if you haven't got around to this one yet, I implore you to give it a listen.
I think for Paul, I really, I think he deserves some respect that maybe he hasn't got in recent history, and I would like to see him have that.
8.5 out of 10. Okay, we're in the top 3 now, and receiving third prize is 1982's Tug of War. This is Paul's first album after the dissolution of Wings, and unlike the previous McCartney's 1 and 2, which were never intended to be actual albums, and also the 1971 album credited to Paul and Linda, this can almost be seen as Paul's first proper solo effort. It was also his most anticipated in years, as it was his first after the death of fellow Beatle and songwriting partner John Lennon. It's almost a little Beatles reunion, with Ringo Starr playing drums on a few tracks, and for the first time since the Beatles' breakup, George Martin is back to produce. The title of the album is very well suited to it, as it plays like a tug of war between the usual optimistic Paul, who was creating some really fun sounds around this time, stacked against the solemn undertones of Lennon's death. This creates an album with some of Paul's more somber tracks of his career, balanced with some of the most euphoric songs of his entire discography. The tug of war theme is apparent right away, as the album actually opens with a fade-in of this team of men heaving and grunting, before Paul goes, "It's a tug of war," which I think is pretty funny. The song itself is a tug of war between the more subdued chorus and then the hopeful verses. It's such a powerful, reassuring song with full sound and immaculate production. This then flows seamlessly into the song Take It Away, one of Paul McCartney's most joyous, uplifting songs he's ever made. I f***ing love this song. McCartney recruited guitarist Eric Stewart from 10cc, who brought with him some of that wall of sound vocal multi-tracking that you can hear on their hit I'm Not In Love. It is intensely up-tempo with Ringo's steady as heck drum beat mixed in with some crazy good percussive action in the chorus. The sax, I think it's a sax solo, it sounds like a sax. Anyway, that towards the end also just really fun. Love this track. The tug of war continues with the slower and more somber Somebody Who Cares. The panpipes and Spanish guitar are very of the time, and the lyrics are a mix of resignation and optimism, and to be honest, even though this is quite a sweet track, it's usually one that I skip. Our hands get rope burn as we heave right back into up-tempo territory with the, in my opinion, superior duet with Stevie Wonder, What's That You're Doing. Stevie makes his Yamaha CS80 synthesizer sound like something between Hendrix's guitar solo and almost like a third vocal of the track. It's a serious banger, this one. I really like it. An even spicier version of it exists on the Twin Freaks album, Paul's 2005 collaboration with DJ Hellraiser. Then we get into maybe Paul's most delicate and also anticipated song he's ever written. His response to John Lennon's murder, the song Here Today. This track was composed as an imaginary conversation between the two, where Paul just wants to open up and be honest about how intimate and close their friendship was, and how he loved him. Traces back to fond memories of when they met, when they cried together. All the while, a George Martin string quartet plays underneath, harking back to yesterday. He explicitly says, "I love you," and that he was glad John came into his life.
For you were in my song.
Just tears. Then we snap back into some pop action on side 2 with the piano romp, Ballroom Dancing, which to me sounds like Paul's very own Elton John number. The song The Pound is Sinking, written in the late 70s, is a track about the absurdity of the stock market with a distinct Beatles flavour. The track Get It is a duet with one of McCartney's early heroes, Carl Perkins.
I just knew I wanted to work with him. I just loved him since I was a kid.
And although it's a fairly enjoyable country song, I do tend to think it's the weak point of the album. Before the last couple of songs, we hear the linking track Be What You See, which barely lasts for 30 seconds, but I swear the vocoder effect on McCartney's voice makes it sound like something right out of a contemporary Tame Impala album. The song Dress Me Up Like a Robber is a very groovy flamenco style track that sounds a bit Yellow Magic Orchestra, a bit Todd Tertier. We end with, for some reason, the most famous song off this album, Ebony and Ivory, the other duet, and if you ask me, the inferior one with Stevie Wonder. The song gets a lot of flack for how overly simplistic the attempt at racial harmony is, and yes, critics absolutely have a point. But the song went to #1 around the world and was McCartney's longest running #1 hit, beating even Hey Jude. Yeah, it's very catchy and has a gorgeous melody. Nearly all of McCartney's albums are eclectic, but Tug of War has got to be one of his most multifaceted records to date, with a genre-hopping tracklist that spans up-tempo pop hits to acoustic tributes to anthemic power ballads to flamenco whimsy. Along with McCartney 2, Tug of War distinguishes the early 80s as one of my favourite periods in McCartney's discography. What I like to refer to as his pop star Paul period, due to all the collabs with other hot young artists, plus just the sheer amount of pop songs he was making at the time. It's a period where he wasn't afraid to deviate from rock and roll and dive into more pop, new wave and that kind of sound. This was the album that really launched Paul McCartney's solo career. From here on out there was no Beatles, no Wings, not even John Lennon. Paul needed a record that would distinguish himself as a true artist, even as he approached his 40s, and Tug of War absolutely delivered. 9 out of 10. In a list of Paul McCartney's greatest albums, there is one that has stood the test of time from the day it was released all the way to now. I'm of course referring to the most successful album of his career, and the one that claims the #2 spot on my list, Band on the Run. This was it for McCartney. It was 1973, and after Wings' last 2 disastrous albums, plus McCartney's generally poor reputation as a recording artist since the Beatles split, he needed to finally make a record that would truly reinvent his and his band's image. And everything pointed to this album not working. Guitarist Henry McCullough and drummer Denny Sywell quit just before the band flew off to Lagos, Nigeria, where they were to record the album, leaving only Paul, Linda, and rhythm guitarist Denny Lane, who would go on to stick with Wings till the bitter end. Lagos at the time was also run by a military government after a civil war, and the studio they were recording in was barely standing upright. Paul and Linda were also mugged at knife point, losing Paul's notebooks of lyrics and demo tapes, meaning he had to rely on his memory to determine how the songs went. And to top it off, Paul also fainted in the studio from a bronchial spasm, which put him out for several days. Despite all this though, the trio pulled out easily the greatest album of Wings' tenure. While it's not a full-blown concept album, the general themes of escape and freedom are pervasive throughout the record.
Round about that time, there was a sort of spirit amongst the young people of like getting away, vigilantes, desperados, and I think that was me doing a nod to that kind of thing.
I also think that the soak up the African sun during the day and record at night mentality really gives the album an unbridled creativity and energy that starts as soon as the needle drops on track 1 and sustains itself all the way to the end. We open on the title track, which has 3 wonderfully imaginative sections oozing with cool. The song's first 2 sections are to me very reminiscent of the Eagles as well, in a good way this time. Paul's also using a synthesizer to actually enhance this and other songs on the album and not just experiment with blips and blops of silly sounds. The band barely gives us a second to recuperate from the epic opener before it gives it a run for its money with the song Jet. That sustained root note on the Moog synthesizer the whole time gives Jet such a banging sound. Paul's wailing vocals on the Little Lady section are just phenomenal. The song Bluebird follows in the same vein of yearning to be free, but gives us a break from the first 2 bombastic tracks. It's a wonderfully breezy song with an almost bossa nova feel, plus some lovely percussion from Lagos native Remy Kabaka. What follows is the song Mrs. Vanderbilt, another brilliant instance of McCartney's pounding melodic bass, which is right at the front of the song and moves it along at a cracking speed. It's really good. We slow down again on the track Let Me Roll It. This song is often mistaken for a John Lennon track. The dirty guitar riff and the tape echo on the vocals very much resembles Lennon's signature 70s sound.
I used an echo that John used to use a lot. So people thought the vocal sound was a bit like John Lennon.
That could have been a Beatles song. Me and John would have sung that good. Man, would have loved to hear it. The song Mamounia is a simple but glistening Afro soul track that is just delightful on the ear. Even Denny Lane's first co-writing credit on the song No Words is perfectly enjoyable. Picasso's Last Words is a delightful song Paul made up on the spot after Paul Newman and Dustin Hoffman tested him to see if he could. I'm not making this up. I love how the reprisal nods to previous songs like Jet and Mrs. Vanderbilt as well. Jet. In most releases of this album, the song Hell on Wheels is usually included, and it should be because it's an absolute rocker. One of Paul's most enjoyable walking bass lines pushes along this super fun driving song. Finally, Britain gets one. I love how on the chorus the vocals just go for broke with enthusiasm. It's pure joy. 1985 is the album's official closer, and it really brings it home with a pelting bass guitar heartbeat that climaxes with a full orchestra, continuing the theme of escape and creating a very cinematic end to one hell of an album. Look, I know it's an obvious one, and it's not going to be a surprise to anyone that this album is this high on this list, but it really does deserve it. I think to further its greatness, you've got to remember that the public wasn't expecting anything good here. After Wildlife and Red Rose Speedway, critics were prepared to cast Paul off as a relic of the 60s, and this was the album that saved his career. And it was after this that he kept up a winning streak on his next two albums and pulled off a massive worldwide tour that finally enabled Wings to be seen as one of the greatest bands of the 1970s. 9.5 out of 10. And now, my number one all-time favorite Paul McCartney album is Kisses on the Bottom. No, I'm just kidding. It's Ram. Wow, could you guess? Bet you didn't see that one coming. You can watch my other video for why I think it's the precursor to the indie pop genre, but now I'd like to take a few minutes to tell you why Ram fucking slaps. McCartney's guitar solo, and it is McCartney's, in Too Many People is god tier. That whole song is just an obliterating rock anthem and also Paul's biggest slight against John Lennon. I love the dreamy soundscapes created on the song Ram On, from nothing more than a ukulele and Paul and Linda's heavenly harmonies. But the real harmonic gem is the track Dear Boy. This song, directed at Linda's first husband for not appreciating what he had while he was with Linda, gives the Beach Boys a total run for their money with some of the sweetest, ethereal harmonies ever committed to tape. The utterly joyous and quirky 5-minute journey that is Uncle Albert Admiral Halsey also went on to become Paul's first gold record as a solo artist. This song is like a wild and wonderful dream, with McCartney just cramming in dozens of musical ideas. But it all somehow fits together in one of the most sparkling epics of his career. The fuzz bass in Smile Away, I'll say it again, the fuzz bass in Smile Away, god damn it! Swing beat, the overdriven guitars. Also, quickly while we're on Smile Away, I know I mentioned in my Ram video that the album has a lo-fi feel to it, and some of you have correctly pointed out that it was recorded by professional musicians in a big studio in New York. And absolutely, this is not Paul recording to his 4-track tape recorder like on the McCartney album. But on some of the songs, for example Smile Away and 3 Legs, they were recorded with the intention of sounding live and a bit disheveled. And that's more what I was talking about. I just wanted to clear that up. Paul wanted to evoke the provincial rustic vibe the album was conceived in.
So it is a little bit more sort of down home, a little bit more funky.
Speaking of which, the song Heart of the Country perfectly encapsulates that domestic bliss atmosphere that Paul and Linda captured so well in many of their early 70s tracks. This song is just a delightful moment for us to catch our breath before we segue into the fierce and fiery Monkberry Moon Delight, which features some of the wildest vocals we will ever hear from McCartney. And also features some monstrous piano work. It's like dropping acid in a Western film. Then we have that delicious, delicious bubbly bass line in the song Eat at Home. This sounds like the track Buddy Holly would have created if he lived through the 60s. Just an ecstatic, carefree, downright horny song that I will never get sick of hearing. The track Long Haired Lady is another loving tribute to Linda, but instead through the lens of a psychedelic Californian atmosphere. It's again very Beach Boys, and Paul and Linda's voices intertwine in a golden, blissful climax. Then on perhaps the greatest final track of any of his albums, The Backseat of My Car, Paul builds from a small guitar and piano tune to a bombastic anthem about the dream of reckless young love, with some absolutely explosive drumming that closes out Paul and Linda McCartney's magnum opus. When it comes to Ram, it's important to remember that this is a breakup album. This is the first release of McCartney once the Beatles had well and truly split up, and McCartney is hurting.
I was heartbroken. I thought I'd be in this band forever.
And then suddenly he, with the help of Linda, has to prove himself as a solo artist while dealing with the pain of Lennon's lucky break that he broke into. This album is McCartney showing us what kind of first-rate artist he is. So much so that he created tunes that would baffle people to the extent that they wouldn't be truly appreciated until years and years later. A few people have called out my claim as it being the first indie pop album. Some have cited the Velvet Underground's late 60s stuff. I see where they're coming from, but I'm not talking about art rock or indie rock, which was more of Lou Reed's niche. And to the other claim that it was Pet Sounds and Smile that should be considered the first indie pop music, fair enough. I definitely think that's a valid point of view, probably along with some of the dozens of other artists that people have listed. I didn't make that video to box Ram into a corner or to make claims that are by any means definitive, but instead I wanted to start a conversation about the genre itself and its origins.
My memories from that period are quite hippie. It's quite sort of Glastonbury, man. You know, beards and stuff.
It's a shame Ram was so critically torn apart upon its release. It makes you wonder that if it had been received well, where McCartney would have taken his next album. Perhaps he wouldn't have felt the pressure to hastily release another album only 7 months later. And maybe it would sound a little more ambitious than what we got, which was Wings' Wildlife, an album that was recorded in a week and generally considered by many critics to be one of his worst. Only about 4 songs from Ram have ever been played live by McCartney, which is criminal, but indicates how complex and layered so many of them are. Like Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey was his first #1 hit. Can you imagine him bringing it out on tour in future? How would they even arrange that? I don't know, but it just adds to the mystery and wonder that is this very special record that I hope will only continue to become more acclaimed and beloved as the years go by. 10 out of 10. So that's the list. I hope I haven't made too many enemies from it. And having one more look at it from worst to best, I think something that speaks to Paul's genius and longevity as an artist is that within my top 5, there is at least one album from every decade besides the 1990s, which is fair as he only released 2 albums during that period. 2 albums from the 70s and then 1 each from the 80s, 2000s, and 2010s shows that he's not some artist who had a distinctly strong period and then everything else was just filler. He may have had the odd album that didn't quite hit the mark, and I've certainly made it clear that I'm no fan of much of his late 80s work, but for the most part, Paul McCartney has consistently delivered quality albums for his entire solo career. And if you include his Beatles period, that's 60 years as an artist who has constantly challenged himself and broken boundaries by always seeking new sounds and unique musical ideas. And if you have any thoughts, which I'm sure you do, I would love to hear them, see them, read them, whatever. If you've got your own Paul McCartney ranking, put it in the comments. Doesn't matter if you haven't heard them all, just give me a top 10 or even 5. I'm just really curious to know what you think. And if it helps, you can even use my handy timeline of the different periods of Paul McCartney's career. I'll also include a quick shot of my other timeline of artists that you can hear in his music over the years. From the artists that influenced McCartney's sound, to the bands that were in turn inspired by him, to pop stars that he worked with at the time. They're all listed here, and if you want a copy of either timeline, you can join my Patreon. And in your own rankings, feel free to include live albums, reworked albums, because you know what? That's what we'll be covering next. It's time to do my lightning round list of all the other Paul McCartney albums. Okay, so this is how it's going to work. I'm first going to be grouping them by category, and then I'll be putting them in their own top 5 list at the end. We're going to start with one of his most divisive releases, the soundtrack to the 1984 film Give My Regards to Broad Street. I won't be talking much about the movie now, but I will be in an upcoming video, so make sure you hit subscribe so you'll be the first to know when it comes out. This soundtrack is mostly made up of re-recordings of hit Macca songs from the Beatles, Wings, and his solo career. It does have 3 new songs on it. Probably the most famous is the song No More Lonely Nights,
No more lonely nights.
which is where you can see him letting go of the fun early 80s period and into the dull dad rock of the late 80s. There's also the song Not Such a Bad Boy, with lyrics that go, I'm not such a bad boy no more. And I was like, Paul, you were never the bad boy. There's a couple of other bits and pieces of new tunes, but nothing really worth mentioning or listening to. Either way, I'll discuss it more in the movie video. I'll also mention real quick that in 1967, Paul was credited as the composer of the music to a film called The Family Way. In reality, this was really Paul composing a 3-minute piece at the increasing behest of producer George Martin, after Paul kept putting off the assignment. But you know what, to be fair, he was making Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Then George Martin took this, quote, sweet little fragment of a waltz tune and arranged other pieces around it. This was an incredibly dull listen, I don't think it counts, and I never watched the movie. Next, let's switch gears now to what I think are 3 of the coolest albums Paul McCartney ever created. I'm talking about the 3 experimental albums he made with producer Youth, who are together known as the Firemen. The first album from '93 is called Strawberries, Oceans, Ships, Forest. Try saying that 10 times fast. The whole thing is built on this deep ambient techno groove that runs throughout the entire album. It's very reminiscent of walking around at 2 a.m. at a music festival. That's just the best description I have of this. It's a very cool vibe, but the few samples that are used do get a bit repetitive as they are used on every track throughout the thing. But it's a wonderful slice of danceable music that I think ravers would just eat up. The Firemen's next album is 1998's Rushes. Containing more than 70 minutes of ambient electronica, it's far more musically expansive than its predecessor. Where Strawberries, Oceans, Ships, Forest had essentially been 9 remixes of the same track, Rushes contains 8 new compositions and a much more psychedelic atmosphere. If you layered some more reverb-soaked voices over the top, you'd have an Animal Collective album. The Firemen's final album to date is immediately recognizable as Paul McCartney, as it's his voice singing on every track, which is different to the first 2, and also his name's on the cover. Yes, Electric Arguments, despite the name, is a completely rock-orientated record, with barely any electronic ambience, as was the go on the previous 2 Firemen LPs. Apart from the fact that it generates a more of a lo-fi atmosphere, this just feels like a Paul McCartney album with a slightly more experimental indie feel to it. In fact, if any of these miscellaneous albums deserved a spot on the studio album list, it would be Electric Arguments. He even performed a song from the album, Sing the Changes, regularly in his live set for 4 years. Take that, press to play. This is, I think, the best album by the Firemen. In fact, I would rate all 3 in release order. Electric Arguments is just more proof that in the mid to late 2000s, Paul just seemed to have found a wellspring of creativity, with albums released in 2005, 7, and 8. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention another album made with Youth and also the band Super Furry Animals, the exploratory and bombastic Liverpool Sound Collage from the year 2000. Definitely his most experimental work across his whole career, in my opinion. It's a very strange collection of sounds to accompany artist Peter Blake's latest art exhibition. The samples, made up of early Beatles session chatter, are very cool.
Boom, boom, boom.
And the song Made Up is a real highlight, and I think the one that sums up the mission of the album, to capture the spirit of Liverpool.
Originally from the Bingles.
However, at 1 hour in length, I don't understand how they couldn't have pulled this off in under 25 minutes. It's a little repetitive, and there's a lot that goes on for way too long, but it's still a super cool record from McCartney. Okay, I am losing the light. I'll be back tomorrow and I'll finish this list. Now on to McCartney's 2 brilliant reimagined albums. And by that I mean 2 albums that he's made before, reconstructed in a completely different style. The first is the quirky and wonderful Thrillington by Percy Thrills Thrillington, aka my favorite name ever. Despite everyone ripping into Paul and Linda's Ram album, it didn't stop McCartney recording an entirely instrumental big band version of it. I bloody love Thrillington. I mean, how could you not? It's a loungy, jazzy reinterpretation of Paul McCartney's best album. And it was done by, of course, Paul McCartney. Years later, it was confirmed that he was indeed Percy Thrills Thrillington, despite what the amazing liner notes of the album will tell you. Paul himself didn't play or sing on it, and it wasn't released until 6 years later in '77, under that truly wild pseudonym. Thrillington is surprisingly imaginative, and the album artwork is first rate. The next reimagined, reworked album is one that came out 5 months ago, McCartney 3 Imagined. This is his McCartney 3 album, but all the songs are remixed, reinterpreted, or straight up covered by other artists. And honestly, I think I love it more than the original. It's Paul being like, look, I'm not a top 40 new artist on the scene, and I haven't been for a long while. That's you guys, so here's what I've made, make it your own. It's a way for his genius to pass on to a new generation of artists. You wanted to ever hear what it would sound like if Gorillaz did a collab with Paul McCartney? What about Ed O'Brien from Radiohead making the track Slidin' the heavy rock song it was always destined to be? Phoebe Bridgers does a gorgeous cover of Seize the Day, and you may have seen this very recent music video promoting Beck's version of Find My Way. These artists are a wonderful representation of today's music, and they've all done a stunning job bringing McCartney's music into a new age. As for McCartney's cover albums, he's got a few, so I'll keep it brief. I can't even pronounce the first one from 1988. Choba B. Also known as the Russian album. This is a collection of 50s rock and roll songs, initially for Russian release only, as a gesture of peace from McCartney towards the end of the Cold War.
Seemed like an opportunity to, extend a hand of friendship.
Yeah. And then released internationally 3 years later. The context seems very weird now based on the West's relationship with Russia. I mean, the album's kind of cool. I honestly don't listen to it all that much, but it does contain the first official recording of Paul performing 20 Flight Rock, which is the song he played for John Lennon when he auditioned for his band, so that's definitely something. McCartney's next cover album was in a pretty similar vein, 1999's Run Devil Run. This is the first public release that he performed on since Linda McCartney's death. Like the Russian album, it's made up of both obscure and familiar 1950s rock and roll songs, along with 3 new tracks from Paul that borrow from the same vintage style.
This is something I've wanted to do for over 20 years. Rock and roll album.
Such as the title song, which sounds just like a Chuck Berry number. Like the Russian album, it was recorded in a blazingly fast 2 days. The songs are all favourites of McCartney, who, after a year of mourning his wife, felt he needed to get back to his musical roots.
Since Linda died, for a year, I haven't really sung.
In many ways, Run Devil Run was the album he made for Linda. Then, in 2012, McCartney put together an absolutely delightful album covering jazz standards and called it Kisses on the Bottom.
Well, I grew up listening to those songs, my dad and his generation, and always grew up loving them and associating those songs with family and good times. I realized how well structured these songs were, and I think I took a lot of my lessons from them.
All the instruments are played by professional jazz musicians, with McCartney contributing only his, and I'm quoting the Apple Music description here, clarinet voice, which really is soothing. He's also got 2 originals on here, including the superb My Valentine, as well as a re-recording of the song Baby's Request from Wings' Back to the Egg album. McCartney said of the project, quote, "This is an album very tender, very intimate. One you listen to at home, after work, with a glass of wine or a cup of tea." I honestly can't give a better description than that.
And the title comes from the opening track.
I know, but a lot of people think that it's a reference to kissing somebody who's behind.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what? I don't think there's much wrong with that either.
Despite the similarities, Run Devil Run is more energetic and urgent than the Russian album. And when you're making a rock and roll record, that's exactly what you want, making it the superior choice for me. But I think Kisses on the Bottom tops them both. Okay, nearly there now, and we are up to one of my favorites. So during McCartney's 2004 tour, he recruited mashup artist DJ Hellraiser, aka Roy Kerr, to perform a half-hour set prior to Paul's gigs. These DJ sets were comprised of remixed McCartney songs from across his career and turned into crazy dance oddities. What came from this is our next album, 2005's Twin Freaks. God damn, this album is banging! I never know what to expect when I see descriptors like experimental, ambient, or electronica when paired with Paul McCartney. But this ain't no Fireman album. This is straight up dance till you drop 21st century bangers. You've got house, techno, electronica, disco, and all taken from existing Paul McCartney tracks like Temporary Secretary, What's That You're Doing, Coming Up. It's never been clear how much actual input McCartney had with the reworking and how much was just done by DJ Hellraiser. But either way, it's one of my favorite creations to come out of his extended body of work. Like, if you thought you didn't like the song Temporary Secretary, listen to the Twin Freaks version. Okay, so as far as Paul's live albums go, it's honestly a bit of a mess. Like, there's 3 different releases from the one singular gig, there's 2 albums that are the same apart from just 4 songs, and don't even ask about including his live DVDs. Cutting the crap, there are 8 live albums. Wings Over America, Tripping the Live Fantastic, Unplugged the Official Bootleg, Paul is Live, Back in the US/World, Good Evening New York City, iTunes Live from Capitol Studios, and the Amoeba gig. The top 3 are Good Evening New York City from 2009, which is a massive accumulation of the hits from his life's work, with lots of Beatles and plenty of Wings and solo tunes. Second best live album is Unplugged, the Official Bootleg. This is an intimate, fully acoustic performance consisting of old covers, Beatles songs, early solo tracks, and also contains the very first song Paul ever wrote.
It was the first song I ever wrote when I was 14.
And the only official recording of it, I Lost My Little Girl. It's a really charming record. I think Paul's almost thrown by how intimate it is. Like, he forgets the lyrics at one point and has to start again.
I only got the words wrong, didn't I? Been a long time. This is so informal. We'll start again. We'll have a few more woohoos. Yeah! Hey, wait a minute. What is the word? Do I have to? I got it. Do I have to keep on?
But that's all included, and it makes it a really, really engaging listen. But the best live record is without a doubt Wings Over America. Apparently, McCartney's sound engineer listened to over 800 hours of songs from Wings' 1976 American tour. He then found the 5 best shows and cut it down to 28 songs across an epic triple album. To be able to hear Paul McCartney and Wings at the height of their popularity in such good quality is simply marvelous. The next time McCartney released a live album, he was approaching 50. So hearing him with such youthful abandon and blazing energy really makes you see how incredible a performer Paul McCartney was and still is. And also that Wings were one of 1970's most sensational live acts, with several songs here sounding better than they do on their studio counterparts. When it comes to compilations, just go for the recent Pure McCartney from 2016. And finally, we are up to the last batch of records, Paul McCartney's classical albums. That's right, between 1991 and 2011, Paul McCartney released 5 classical albums that consist of operas, reworkings of previous songs, and a ballet. I'll quickly sum them up because who's really listening at this point? First is Paul McCartney's Liverpool Oratorio from 1991, a full 1.5 hour length opera in English. There are moments where a melody or a lyric jumps out as recognizably McCartney, but mostly it's a completely different affair to anything we've heard from him before. I'm not that smart with stuff like this, I don't really know how to judge a classical or a symphonic piece, but the unanimous verdict upon its release is that while Liverpool Oratorio is attractive, it's simplistic, overlong, and fairly insubstantial. And I think I understand what the critics are saying here.
What's for dinner?
I like that Paul really went for it with this and tried something way out of his comfort zone. And it really is pretty in parts, but not something I see myself ever going back to. Next is 1997's Standing Stone, a slightly shorter piece with no libretto. This one reminds me more of a movie soundtrack, maybe by someone like Howard Shore. I can see something like a ballet, or maybe more appropriately like a Fantasia, made with this kind of music, because it does definitely evoke a lot of feeling. 2 years later, McCartney came out with Working Classical, which is basically the Vitamin String Quartet does Paul McCartney, with some forgettable original compositions from Macca. Nice to listen to, but that's it. Then in 2006, he released Ekekemoramium. Oh, it's so late and I don't know how to pronounce this. Anyway, it's Latin for Behold My Heart. And this is a noticeably more mature opera than anything we've heard before, in both arrangement and libretto. It's just got a more sophisticated sound. Like, Paul's definitely got a better grasp of the medium around this point. That being said, it didn't make it any more interesting to listen to for me. Too much of it just reminded me of being in church as a kid, which is just not my jam. And then finally, we wrap up the classical albums with Ocean's Kingdom. Definitely his best classical album yet, in my opinion. It really makes it more interesting to listen to, knowing that there's a ballet that accompanies this.
Peter said to me, would you ever consider writing something for ballet? And I basically said yes.
The sound is sweet as usual, but more developed and less clunky than before. Again, I'm not a great judge of a ballet I've only heard and not seen, so it wasn't like it was riveting to listen to, but I would probably go and see it given the opportunity. So there is classical albums, and I like that on each he at least attempts something a little bit different. It's on these albums that he's really expanding his style and abilities to the absolute limit. Okay, now I've mentioned every single Paul McCartney album. And of these miscellaneous records, my top 6, yeah, I couldn't do it in 5, I have to do 6. At number 6, the Jazz Standards album, Kisses on the Bottom. Number 5, his big band reworking of Ram, Thrillington. Number 4, his latest and most ambitious album as The Fireman, Electric Arguments. Number 3, the reinterpretation of McCartney 3 by other artists, McCartney 3 Imagined. Number 2, the sensationally danceable mashup album, Twin Freaks. And number 1, the absolute epic live album, Wings Over America. Now please don't ask me to insert this list into the original one because I think my head might explode. But I will say those top 2 albums, Twin Freaks and Wings Over America, those are 2 albums that I've listened to probably as much as anything from his top 5. So what can we take away from an artist who created this much music? I'm going to use a quote from Paul when he was doing press for McCartney 3 and he was asked if this would be his last album. He said, "When we did Abbey Road, I was dead, so everything else is a bonus." Well, that everything else consists of 51 years of spectacular music with nearly as many albums. Paul McCartney is, for me, the greatest musical artist of all time. And despite him being a Beatle and essentially holding the title of most famous man in the world for nearly 60 years, I still don't think his impact will truly be felt until after he's gone, because there's no one even close that matches up to the gifts he has given us, and I don't think there ever will be again. Okay, well I kind of can't believe that any of you are still watching, but if you are, thank you so much once again. And if you got to this point, you probably enjoyed the video, I hope. This took me a really long time to make, and I truly loved creating it. And I want to make videos full time. But making YouTube my full-time job means I need your support, especially when I'm using material that can be easily copyrighted like music and films. Patreon is one of the few ways that will enable me to make a living from making the videos that you want to see. So if you enjoyed this video and can appreciate the amount of time and effort it took to put it together, please consider joining at the link in the description. You'll get to see the extensive notes from this video, plus I'm going to explain how I actually made it, how I listened to almost 100 hours of McCartney music and compiled this list. And because I had so much fun making this, I'm definitely going to make one on John Lennon's and George Harrison's solo albums. Plus, I might even do a top 50 McCartney songs list at one point, so please make sure you're subscribed so you'll be the first to know when it comes out. And don't forget about the Paul McCartney playlist that I've popped in the description. They're a lot of fun. I think you'll really enjoy listening to them. Alright, thank you so much once again. That is all from me. Go and listen to some of this amazing music, and I will catch you all in the next one.
Are you sure you want to end this video?